Well, that should be working. That should be working. Ooh, Leslie's been subscribed to the channel 22 months on Twitch. Thank you. And many months before that on YouTube. Okay, so, buffer. Buffer. Ah, that's the one I was looking for. Yes, it is. Ah, glad. Yes, Clarke's here. No relation, but yes, it is her topic. Ay, caramba. Let's see if that goes live and works. Hello everyone. So, this is last week's video. Oh god, what's happened to the hair? Yeah, I came back from a family event for I need to shower because I look sweaty. And you cannot tell from my hair at all, can you? You cannot tell at all. Hello everyone, how are we all doing? Powder Monkey is connected. That's good. Questions are open, as always. Hello everyone, right then, so we are live, and we are talking about Task Force Doctrine, and development task force structure. And it's kind of an interesting one, because it's one of those things where people often make big, grandiose statements about task forces, but actually the history is rather nuanced, and history is rather fun. So that's what we're doing today. We're looking at the nuances of the history, as well as the fun stuff, so we'll see what happens. We have another heatwave coming next week. I don't think I had the money necessary to buy air conditioning, so thank you for telling me that, Knight. Another heatwave is coming next week. I am going to be crying. Thank you, Jack Ray, for the memberships gifted to Seneca Nero, Arlen Wolf, Mr. Lambo, cool, Jacob Dill, and Amarafan. Hello, all of you got memberships, cool. Thank you very much, Jack Ray. Thank you. Now, Task Force Doctrine, from Model 1 to Model 2. It's kind of an interesting one. Because you see, there's a lot of doctrine which gets codified in the 1920s and 30s, which had just existed. Okay? It had just existed. So, this is one of those fun things. When we're talking about task forces and the origins of it, there are some very good articles to go and read out there, which are going to make some claims which are, how do I put this? Most of these actual articles are quite well and factually written. They are quite good. And there's some really good articles in this book. Well, journal article. It's thick enough it could be its own book. But, you know, it's volume 36, issue 1, 2020, from the Defense and Security Analysis. And if you look down there, you'll find research note by Colin D. Robinson, US Navy's Task Forces 1 to 199. The thing is, if you look through the list, there are some very good authors and some very good articles in that list. That is probably the best article in there. However, in the defense of Colin Robinson, there are a lot of people who then take claims from this article and start going and saying things which he doesn't himself say. And it's used often, and I put that, it's used often as a thing which it tells you that task force is an American invention in the 1940s. It's not wrong. We're going to discuss the origins, but the reason I'm going to say it's not wrong, what it is writing the task force form of the whole numerical task force and the numbering and the point system. So basically, the Americans do what the Americans often do very, very well. They take ideas which have been long-standing and well-developed, and they turn it into a system which is actually administratively far more flexible and far more sensible and easy to follow. Because the thing is, when we're talking about task forces, you also have to talk about the fact that the British have the Force A, Force B, Force K, Forces 1, 2, different couple of numbers, that, you know, that they have as their formations hunting surface raiders and doing various other operations. The British often using force structure. And whilst I was once told by someone honestly that you cannot argue that Force K is a task force or Force H is a task force because they are called a force, not a task force. I did suggest that that person might be trying to split hairs to make their point. Okay? This is the thing. What we have realistically is we have a task force as a concept has been around for a very, very long time. Ad hoc formations brought together from either what is available, what is appropriate for an operation, or tasking, which will then be returned to their normal units afterwards. They're not going to be usually a contiguous squadron of vessels, they're not going to be necessarily a homogeneous group, they're going to be a mixture of what's needed for the operation. And the big advantage of it is you can put in charge who needs to be in charge, and you can structure it that way, instead of having to look for a person of appropriate rank for that structure. You know, if you have a squadron or a fleet, you're looking for someone of a certain rank. You are. Now, the French even have the Force de Rad and the Forces de Haute Mer, or the Forces of the High Seas. You know, there are a lot of forces around, there are a lot of force structures. So these are things which already exist. And why am I saying this? Because it makes sense to understand they already exist. They're already part of everyone else's structure. What they aren't, and what I have to admit, the really annoying thing for other people's perspective, is they aren't really grouped up, as we would call them. See, the example I give is the Falklands War. Now, the Falklands War is interesting because the Falklands War, they go through about 4 different task force, task group emulations and evolutions within about 4 days. So, surprise, surprise, some people get confused. At one point, they decide to make Sandy Woodward CTG 317.8 and put everyone else underneath him because he's a rear admiral going south. And then they realise he doesn't have the officers, he doesn't have the breadth of team needed to actually be what is in effect a task force commander. The task force commander, CTF 317, is back in the UK. That's Admiral Sir John Fieldhouse, running it from the UK. Because remember, they're not sending a vice admiral south because if a vice admiral failed, it would look bad. But the thing is, they're sending a rear admiral south whose forces task group is orientated around a surface action exercise, then has been moved into a carrier for a carrier battle group command, and he hasn't been given a necessary structure to be a task force commander. And actually, the person who actually has a larger staff down there is Mike Clarke. And so they very quickly go, okay, right then we've got to change this. And, well, Sandy Woodward is in charge of a carrier task group. So that makes sense. Michael Clarke is the amphibious task group. That is another task group. So we can't call it a task unit, so we're going to call it a task group. And so is Julian Thompson. So they make them CTG 317.0 for Michael Clarke, his task group. CTG 3.1.7.1, that is the landing force. That is the i.e. 3rd Commando Brigade in St. State. CTG 317.8, Sandy Woodward, carrier battle group. CTG 317.9, Captain Brian Young, Commander Operation Paraquet Group. so going off and doing his own operation. And then CTG 324.3, Vice Admiral Peter Herbert, who's in charge of the submarines. That's what they have going on. Flag Officer Submarines retains command of the submarines. Basically, the first structure put forward would make sense if they were sending a guy called Derek Rafael south, and he was actually in charge of the task force, and therefore you had task force, surface task force, and subsurface task force, all under fleet operations. But they don't have that. They're not operating on a fleet basis, they're operating on a task force basis. So that then causes trouble. That causes the issues. And basically they're trying to muck around with it. And so this is what the Americans come up with, which is really cool for Task Force Doctrine. They basically come with the idea of, we give them numbers, and each of the units below has a slightly different number with us adding on. So if you see 38, you know that's the highest task force. The moment you see a 38.1, that's a task group. 38.2.1, that's a task unit. Okay? So basically, that's the idea we have going on. This is the point. Now, I don't want to... I'm trying to be careful here, because I don't want to be used as some people use that article, basically going, oh, no, the Americans didn't come with us. No, the Americans came with this part. The idea of numerically organizing the task groups in this fashion to make it easy on an administrative level to command and control. Which is really important in World War II. And really friggin' useful. Don't get me wrong. But Task Force Doctrine is different than Task Force Organization. They've come with a very good labeling of it. And Night's Wolf. And that's the thing. That's a good thing. It's a useful thing to have all this stuff going on. Now, when we say that, what about prior to World War I? Well, task forces are around. In fact, it's quite common. The Force Doctrine is quite a common operational strategy. Let's say you're an admiral, and you've got a fleet. And you're expecting a fleet action, but you already have an inshore squadron off watching the main enemy in the harbour. But you know the enemy has another couple of ships of the line sitting in another harbour, not far down the coast. And you need someone to go watch them. Well, the trouble is, if you detail off one of your admirals, you're going to be sending off a squadron, aren't you? An admiral's not going to go anywhere without superiority of numbers. I might even insist on taking their flagship with them, which means that's one of your second rates potentially going, or first rates going. You can't afford to lose that with major fleet action potentially coming. So what do? You look on your captains, and if they're senior enough, you don't bother. You tell them to go off with a couple of more junior captains, and those ships go off, and that's the pick the captain of choice. Let's say it's Clarke. I'll be self-serving here, and that'd be called Clarke Force, because basically it goes from Clarke's force will go down there to, on that we need to work out what we're talking about. Well, that's Clarke Force there, isn't it? It's that simple. So let's say it was, 364s. Clarke Force. We go. Clarke Force. We're off. And that's useful. That is a useful force. It's gone off. It's doing its job. It's not detracting from your overall force structure. It's not detracting from your command structure. You don't have to have an argument with another admiral over which one you can attach off to it. It's bad enough when you're forming up the inshore squadron. It really is. It's hard enough. Now, if you don't have a senior captain who you trust to lead an independent force, and let's be honest, as I've said before, The Royal Navy has ways of getting rid of captains who are not going to make good admirals. There are plenty of officers who are very good captains who should never become admirals. They can... the last thing is to promote them to the yellow. The other option they have is to give them a nice post as in a dockyard. All sorts of options. And, you know, they have capabilities of doing these things on how to get rid of them. But let's say they also have a young captain who's probably pretty good. Well, then you reach into your back pocket as a local senior officer and you go, "I pronounce you Commodore!" And the Royal Navy goes, "Yes!" And here's the thing. Are you a Commodore pennant or a Commodore flag? If you've just got a pennant, you're flying Commodore's pennant because you're acting on the local station or station commander's or air fleet commander's authority. So you're a Commodore pennant. If you're actually given a Commodore's rank by the Admiralty, you're a Commodore flag. Now this starts off in this period. It can be interesting. Why? Because occasionally the Admiralty itself actually has to reach into that particular drawer when they are dealing with stations which may have interesting command structures and issues, and an Admiral dies on station and there is no Admiral on station. It should go to the senior captain, and they don't really trust the senior captain, and a letter is quickly sent, quickly dispatched home, and a letter arrives back out before they can send us. Yeah, they'd love to send another senior officer, etc., but sometimes you can't. And so the note will come out going, "We've appointed this officer for his great actions in the last battle where so and so and so and so happened to be, killed. So we no longer have that senior officer. Or so, for his great in service and wonderful service, we promote him to this. So we promote this other officer to Commodore flag." And that's where it comes from. Basically, that was the backing option. Now the thing is, often when it's just a couple of ships going off, Nelson, again, a good example. Nelson led many what we would call task forces, and what were called Nelson forces in that time period. Before he became an admiral, he's doing things in the Caribbean. He's doing all sorts of operations. Yes, those were called Nelson force. Actually, one of them was called Collingwood Force, but we'll leave that to one side. If I have two Clarks, then I have a problem, but it's not impossible to deal with. Basically, at that point, they tended to either go with their nicknames or go with their flagships' names, because the ships would not have the same names. So you'd call it. Let's say I was commanding from HMS Africa, it'd be called Africa Force, or HMS Swifter, it'd be called Swifter Force. That's how you dealt with it. But the trouble is, I would argue, for the Royal Navy, they got very comfortable doing that and using that system. And it had worked very well for them for several hundred years. Which is why, when they're looking in the 1920s and 30s, they're not really thinking about how we're going to deal with task force structure in the modern era, because what they're thinking about is how they're going to use task forces, not how they're going to administer them and command and control them. It's the Americans thinking about that, because the Americans haven't got that history. Now, I'm told quite often that the Falklands, that World War I has no task forces. I was once told this after I just given a presentation on a certain task force for World War I, called the Harwich Force. The Harwich Force is built around a cruiser squadron and 2 destroyer flotillas, plus submarines and seaplane carriers for some certain operations. It is called the Harwich Striking Force, or the Harwich Force. And it is probably one of the most interesting organisations in World War I in its approach to command structure and its actions and its operations. And yes, it was commanded by a Rear Admiral, a Commodore and a Rear Admiral, and, senior officers for quite a while. But, to be fair to them, and I do mean this is to be fair to them, they were more given that level of seniority to command them, because that was A, a more common seniority than it is today. There are a lot more rear admirals wandering around. And B, and this is more important than anything, you're still talking about a navy which was still getting over the effects of the Edwardian era, late Victorian Edwardian era, and the command structures implemented during that period. And that means that navy, in the nicest way, and I do mean in the nicest way, has a problem with letting captains be captains now and go off and command their ships and act independently. And even destroyer captains have that issue. So what you do to make it viable and make it work is you give them a rear admiral who's going to encourage that kind of atmosphere, encourage them to go do those sort of things, and is going to be the admiral who's going to deal with the other admirals when they go, yeah. You know, the advantage of this force structure is, if you mucked around with Harwich Force and you tried to argue them, you then have to deal with Turret. And he'd look at you and go, oh, you want an argument? Oh, you want to critique my force's performance? Oh, you want to have fun. Turret was a pretty good commander in that way. And it's also where you get a lot of the later British period where, you know, you have the approach of destroyer officers and senior destroyer officers to their crews where, as long as you're attempting to attack the enemy, you will have my support. And I will make sure you get through it. Now, it's always fun when we're talking through this, because this particular force gets up into quite a lot of different actions, where sometimes the cruisers are involved, sometimes they're not. Sometimes it's just the destroyer flotillas. Sometimes it's a whirling dervish of a fight, where some destroyers are fighting, some destroyers aren't even anywhere near there. Now, if you're kidding, that really sounds like a task force named after base of operations. Yeah, it's exactly that. It's exactly British Force British Force history. It's literally, we've named it after Harwich. That's where we're operating it from. It comes straight out of the British playbook for Task Force Doctrine. When we're talking battlecruiser fleets, honestly, they are a fleet. And the fleet is it's interesting enough, squadrons and flotillas are homogeneous units. Fleets and task forces aren't. So what's the difference between a fleet and a task force, I'm often asked. A fleet is a completely self-sufficient organisation. A task force is still going to depend on others. So the battlecruiser fleet theoretically is entirely independent, but as we all know, is very much dependent on the Grand Fleet for its operational support. So technically, you could argue that if we go back to this designation, the Grand Fleet would be, I don't know, the fleet. Let's say Task Force Fleet. Let's say 3rd Fleet or 5th Fleet. And the Grand Fleet would be, I don't know, the fleet itself would be Task Force whatever, GF, and then technically the battle cruisers would be GF BCF. I suppose if we're putting letters into the number system. Yeah, they are in reality dependent upon the Grand Fleet for a lot of what they want to do, and a lot of what they need to do. So that does cause some trouble. It does. Now, the interesting thing for... Take my pill. when he's putting the task forces together, the Harwich task force together, is the most important thing for him is that it only works if his officers are of keen individuality. Please note, he didn't say keen intelligence. He presumed they would have to be a level of smart to be his officers. He wants them to have keen individuality. Why? Because they have to be able to operate as well independently as they can as part of a group. So they have to be both an individual and keen. I.e., they have to be motivated to work together. And that's an interesting approach when we think about it, modern task forces and modern structures and how we approach building these force formations at sea and how, you know, the officers we put in them. Yeah, are we still keeping to that? I do wonder. Mike Cooch, would you describe Sturdy's force in a Battle of the Falklands as a task force or was it a squadron? Technically it's a squadron because he takes his battle cruisers south as a homogeneous unit. And then everyone else groups around him squadron. But also Sturdy has the advantage of being a senior enough admiral. And he's basically taking charge of everything he comes in contact with. In modern parlance, it would be called a task force once they're grouped together, but technically he was the battle cruiser squadron commander down there. It was just he outranked everyone else and everyone sort of followed his command at that point. But then we had the Zeebrugge raid. Now this is always an interesting one to me from a command perspective, because the Zeebrugge raid is, well, how do I put this politely? It's one of those attempts to block one of Belgium's better ports, actually, not their best port. Although that is something which I have watched Belgian people argue over for quite a long time, so I'm not getting into that. And in this scenario, you have Roger Keyes, you have Reginald Bacon, you have John Jellicoe, you have a lot of senior officers involved. And you even have Commodore Reginald Turret, who proposed it in 1916. I think potentially by this point, because Harwich Force was usually run by Commodores, but they were basically treated as rear admirals. I think Turret. Let's see, when was he exactly promoted to Rear Admiral? God, that's a disturbingly hard thing to find out for him. But, yeah. It's in my notes, but it's in my notes as two different potential dates. Helpful at this point. But you have Roger Keyes providing the directorate for the Plans Division of the Admiralty. He's got there in October 1917. And he's another one who's supported turrets and comes out from the Harwich Force and is working with them. And the whole idea is they want to use the firepower, the operational capability of the Harwich Force, and firepower on, including Sir John Moore, which was a monitor, and HMS General Crawford, which was another monitor, to bombard and do all sorts of things, and also add in some blocking ships. The idea was that they would take volunteer crews from the Grand Fleet for the hazardous service, and they would use them to carry out this, what they're calling an offensive action, to stop German submarines, especially, and some of the torpedo boats, from being able to operate out of Zeebrugge efficiently. Now, why do you want to do this? Well, there's lots of reasons, sensible reasons given. But if anyone knows, what were the British planning at the end of World War I? What was starting to come up as a plan for how they were going to break the Western Front, how they were going to break through the stalemate that was the trenches. Anyone have an idea of what the British planning? Right on Wilhelm's Harbour. That is a thing they're planning to do with sort of cuckoos. But that's not their plan for breaking the trench line. They're planning on going round. I've talked about this before. They're planning amphibious operations to go round, and landings. And basically to go round the Germans, land in other parts of Belgium. They want to go round, round the Dutch, land on the North Sea coast of Germany, all these things. They're talking about doing that. If the Germans are able to operate and support ships from Zeebrugge, well, then that's far more difficult for the landings. It's far more likely to find problems, far more likely to find enemy action holding them up. And so if they can take the port out, and they can cease it being operationally viable, then they've given themselves a stronger position. But again, you have all those names involved, all those very senior people, which is lovely to have. It is lovely to have a lot of senior people, putting forward ideas for what could be done and be involved. But in reality, when you're looking at the structure being put together, the force structure being put together, the British order of battle is the most assembled from the Dover Patrol, assembled from Harwich, assembled from all sorts of units they can get. They've got a dozen or so monitors. They've got Royal Navy, Royal Marines, Royal Marine Artillery. They've got some French torpedo boats and all these things. It is a classic task force operation with different things broken up into different task groups to do different duties. All of mixed combat capability, all of mixed force structures. It is that classic operation. In fact, when you look at its command structure and the way it's put together and organised, it starts to look very, very much like the operations which are carried out in World War II when it comes to amphibious operations. And it really does. You've got bombardment groups. You've got assault groups. You've got diversionary groups. It works. It's what they're looking at, and it's what works. And it was a bunch of aggressive madmen. Yes, it was a time when Britain had really rather large access to them, and far too many of them ended up in the Royal Navy. Why do I say far too many? Because the army was always short of them. So by the end of World War I, you have a lot of task forces wandering around. There's a lot of force structure. There's a lot of task force structure being used because, again, homogeneous units are great for administration in peacetime. They're great for organisation. They are great for, I want to guarantee I have the availability of 6 destroyers. Well, a formation which is in charge of 24 destroyers can do that far better than 4 different organisations which each have 6 destroyers, 3 cruisers, etc. and all these things. It's far easier for you to guarantee the availability of stuff when you control all the stuff through a simple structure. But the thing is, what works in peacetime isn't necessarily what works in wartime. And that's one of the problems, really. Because you can get very lazy in peacetime when things work. And then you can be called a complete cropper in wartime when it doesn't. A complete and utter cropper. With that being said, James Book Plug. So, first things first. The Patreon vote hasn't gone live yet, and will probably go live tomorrow now, because honestly, something's weird has happened, and when I looked on it, half the points which are supposed to be things you could tick were empty. So I'm not sure what's happened. Not sure what happened at all. I'm going to redo it. It'll get redone. I couldn't because of family things going on today, but it's going to get redone. I, did manage to get the gazebo built and painted. All 3 coats before the events for today. So I apologise if I am moderately tired and not going to probably do Discord this evening. I did. Alright, let's put it this way. For the getting married again, for my aunt, the aunt and uncle who were doing that, my aunt wanted to do it in her garden, and she found a gazebo, literally the day before, that she wanted to do have it take place in. It was built. It was painted. Has all been put up. They have renewed their vows. They have been together for 60 years. When you've been together that long, if you want to renew your vows, you'll renew your vows. And if you want a gazebo, then your nephew, who is a sober, functioning insomniac, will build the gazebo magically overnight. Oh, seriously. I had the wonderful thing of my mum came this morning, went, "You're awake, it's built. How did you get it so evenly painted in the dark?" I went for I have one of those hats which has LED lights in, and I actually have four different hats, which all have the same. Likely all have the same light settings. So basically, what I did was I had 3 on charge, 1 in use, and then just swap them out. Oh, since then I thought, okay, now it's going to be a party. I can relax, have food. Oh no, no. Of course, my granddad is no longer with us, and neither is his brother. So the senior surviving male from her family line is apparently me. So I ended up having to walk her down the aisle, because she decided then she wanted to be walked down the aisle. So I had to wear a suit in the middle of the day. It was lovely. It was a wonderful ceremony. It was a great pleasure to take part. I was very happy when finally afterwards I managed to get some food. But it was lovely. It was, yes. Yeah, it was a wonderful time. They have been married since they were 16 and 17. And we all enjoyed it. So, yes. Hence, I'm just giving a heads up. I will probably come on Discord after this evening to chat away with people. But don't expect me on there for too long, because I'm not so much tired as I'm all peopled out. There have been a lot of people. There are people in my house. There is still another family event to come on Monday. Another big family event. There's a reason there's so many of us coming out of the woodworks. And doing that, and I am all peopled out. My social battery is empty. I have quite good social battery normally, but there is a point at which it is suddenly run out a bit. Yeah, I'm calling it a gazebo, but it's sort of a wooden gazebo sort of thing. It's an octagonal shape. I can't think of a different name for it. At the moment, I really can't think. The other thing would be a bandstand, but it's not big enough for a band. It really isn't. It's got little curved benches in it, which I added, which I also built and put in there, and I stained them while I was painting. I painted that white and I stained the benches, and it was lovely. But yeah, have you tried cuddling a dog on the couch? The dogs are hiding from people as well at the moment. There is literally, and I will not do this to the poor dog because he's hiding fervently, but there's a little face poking out from underneath my bed down there, going, "No, please, no." But it's a nice wooden structure. It's got a little wooden roof. It's lovely. Basically built it. Had it fully assembled by about 1 a.m. First coat on by 2 a.m. Had to wait an hour for it to dry. Then next coat, and then next coat. Had it all done painted by about 5 a.m. It's a temporary structure. No, the feet have been concreted into the ground, so it's temporary within. Now, again, pavilion sounds far too grand for it is. Yeah, so thank you very much for your support of the channel. Thank you for liking, sharing, subscribing. Thank you for helping everything go. It really wouldn't happen without you. This is the weird thing I find. Consultancy is slightly more reliable than universities, but still, it is the support which comes in from Patreon, the support which comes in from YouTube. Thanks to all of you, which is still the most reliable income streams I have every month and allow me to do all the research and all the stuff I do, so thank you for making it all possible. There are some interesting things coming up. I can't tell you too much about it, but I'm going to be doing some TV filming in September for a program which you're going to be seeing hopefully next year. And I've got a few other things coming along. Little things which could be very interesting to you. And that includes doing some stuff maybe with Britain at War, who are a really cool magazine, who were the people who organised the Leeds conference last year. And yeah, if you're doing anything interesting, if you want to go see some interesting stuff, they've got some very interesting ideas come out, and very interesting things. I would also add, and this is an important thing for you, if anyone's coming down to Cornwall on holiday at all this year, I happen to really recommend going to Falmouth Maritime Museum. Okay, it's part of the National Maritime Museum, and it's a bit which is often forgotten. And I know I normally use this bit for just saying thank you for liking, sharing, subscribing to all those things, but it's a case of it's a really cool museum. Pendennis Castle is probably my favourite museum and favourite place in Cornwall to take people on a history tour. The shipshape crew complain they get dragged down almost every time they come down. They're in St Michael's Mount. But the National Maritime Museum is a place which you really do want to visit as well. They've got some really cool exhibits. It's not the biggest museum in the world, so don't go in there thinking, I'm going to spend days in this museum. You're not. But there's nothing wrong with that, because there's plenty to wander around Falmouth and have a look around afterwards. There are tons of cool bookstores, including one which is threatening to become a pasty shop if people don't buy her books. I highly recommend that one. Now, the reality of it is, it's a sort of museum where you get to have a lot of hands-on stuff. So if you've got younger kids, you can take them and they can steer boats around, and they have a pool that they can take sailing boats around, and they can show them how to maneuver them, etc. It's a lot of fun, especially if you do play Pirates of the Caribbean. You'd like that one. They also have some boat building going on there, that you can see traditional boats and how they are built. For ship's boats, that's what they're literally building, ship's boats. The boats which used to go on board ships and used to be, they are building them on site. It's really, really cool. And it's worth a visit. Now, will this be international television? I hope so. I hope it is. I think it's going to be. It's going to be a lot of international broadcasts. I think it is going to be. If it's Mysteries of the Deep next season, I wouldn't mind doing another Mysteries of the Deep. There have been talks, but I'm never quite sure, because that's one of those programs which I swear they sort of keep on the back burner, and then they know it does good stuff. I don't necessarily get stellar views, but I know it gets good quality views. And I think sometimes they literally treat Mysteries of Deep of, we're going to see if there are better ideas. If there aren't, we'll then do another series of Mysteries of Deep. And yeah. And I will also open up quickly the Discord and look at the questions coming through. because I do have the bot open, so I'll quickly check the questions. But yeah, the TV work, that's going to be international. That is going to be international. There's all sorts of fun things on that front. And Jack Ray does deserve a lot of kudos here at the moment, because Jack Ray has produced a very fun site, which I currently have to admit I'm using, to wander through and find out if there are any areas I haven't covered in enough detail yet that I wanted to cover. And I'm not sure if Jack expected me to be using it as that. But I'm using it basically as a, oh, I haven't yet covered that part. I can do that. Oh, I can do this. Oh, I can do this. And it's, yeah. Okay. Damn. How many lessons were not learned on the German Marines' attacks on convoys in general? So many. Look, if we're talking about German attacks on submarines and convoys in general, it's one of those things of, you can get a lot of false positives very easily. You know, one of the things that comes out when you start looking into the history of anti-submarine warfare is the fact that they have to demonstrate by exercise, by theoretical exercise, that the only way these ships could be being sunk is if there is a submarine going up and down the middle of the convoy. And yet you have hundreds and hundreds of accounts, of first-person accounts of what have been going on in the convoys, and some of them have been pointing to that, but most of them have been pointing to attacks from external, because that was where the presumed attack was coming from. Mark 9 Hawk. Will be interesting to see how Dinosaur, Cough Medicine, Brontenax shapes up from BA shapes up as a carrier. It'll be interesting to see, because so far I don't think it is carrier spec, because I haven't seen the level of landing gear and build build that I would expect it to have for continual carrier operations. And please note, there is a thing of, this can operate from a carrier, but this can operate from a carrier. So there's a, we can put this aboard a carrier and it can take off and land. And it can do some operations. But it's kind of like the Seafire in World War II. That could operate from an aircraft carrier. You're going to be patching the wings and the legs and the fuselage because your frame is going to keep cracking. And you can operate from the carrier. Like the Fairy Fulmar, like the Swordfish, like, you know, the aircraft which could actually do carrier operations and survive it. So I'll be interested to see where it is. Nice to remember, why didn't Task Force Doctrine exist before the Age of Steam and Steel? I think I've showed you it did. It was just called Force Doctrine. What's the triplets? Were the naval treaties doomed to fail? Was there a way to make them work? Ooh. Yeah, I do need to work on this suit, don't I? Again, although the thing is, my plan is to get a new one soon. When I move back down to theirs. Was there a way to make them work? There was. Honestly, the task force, the treaties could be made to work if you could have made them building treaties rather than no building treaties. I think that's the trouble. People they shot for the moon, and if you made them a building treaty so people could carry on building, but they had to build within a certain limit, you'd have actually made them keep to those limits, because they'd have built all their force structure around building those limits and they'd built in. Rather than having what you have, which is people can't build for a while, can't build, get pissed off more and more and more they can't build, and then when they can build they go nuts. So I think you needed to have something which was basically, you can build within this level of this level of category, and you can build what you need within that, and just see what they produce. Now, Clarke's asked, what effect was the treaties have on Task Force Doctrine's development? Well, we're going to talk about that because we're getting into that one. Basically, I've given you the pre-stuff, and now we're getting into 1920s and 30s and what happens in that period for development of task forces. And for each navies, they have slightly different impacts. For some navies, it really does have a negative impact on the development of their task force doctrine. I would say, if you're looking at the Regia Marina, if you're looking at Marine Nationale, if you're looking to an extent at the Imperial Japanese Navy, you're looking at a negative for task force doctrine. But, you know, fun times for all of them. Also, where can we watch Mr. Jutsu and still get your residuals? Experts don't get residuals. We're not actors. We don't get residuals. We get paid to turn up. So basically, when I go do filming, I get paid a day rate. And I get paid money for the day, I basically get half days for travel days. And I get a day's pay for filming. And I'll get my travel costs provided. And accommodations. Sometimes they'll waive they'll say they won't do the half days, but they'll pay the travel costs. For example, the filming I've got coming up later this year, they're giving me the night before and night after in a hotel, and the travel up and down. Because they want me to come from Cornwall to go up to do their filming, and they want a full day of filming, so in a nice way it's 7 hours. I don't mind. I don't mind. It's perfectly fine by me. But that is what they do. So I'll be spending you probably know when the filming happens, because there'll probably be pictures of me and various shipshape crew getting together in London near Belfast or something like that. Because I think there's actually a couple of us involved in the filming. I know there's probably at least myself and one other. Everyone, there's never a sort of specific ship type of a ship being considered as Task Force flagship. Specific type of ship to be Task Force flagship. That is something which comes in terms of, that's an operational reality. Usually it's the largest ship in the group. Versus the actual doctrinal idea. And that's why the next one is... The answer to that is yes. If they're the largest ship in the group, they're going to be the task group, the flagship task group of the task force. And actually, that's an interesting thing. That is a really interesting thing. Is that someone actually had asked me to war game this the other week with them, and we sat down and we were talking it through. And ended up involving more than me because someone else rang up and we sort of from a ship shape and we were both talking it through. But basically, the war game was this: what happens to American carrier task groups if they've got a Lexington class battlecruiser as a flagship with them? And the answer is a lot. You'd be amazed at how much better certain aspects get for the American command and control when you have a Lexington class to act as the flagship. Because it has a lot more space for the flag. You'd be also amazed at how much worse some things get, because it means you don't have direct access to a lot of the information which the carrier can get. You're not sitting at the center of the information node, you're sitting off-center. And it's kind of an interesting thing to work it through. It's better from the point of view of having staff and having the space for staff. It's not so good from the point of view of actually having the information. But conversely, the battlecruiser can carry its own scout aircraft and do its own scouting. It's a fun thing to get into. With that being said, though, I think that's all the questions done for now, and we'll carry on. So, 1920s, you have 3 officers leading for the major navies a lot of discussions of task forces and task force structures. For the Royal Navy, it's the then 3rd Sea Lord, Rear Admiral Frederick Field. He's important. He is really, really smart and really quite capable. For the US Navy, it's the President of the Naval War College, Rear Admiral William Sims. The guy who got into an argument over naval funding with politicians, instead of getting in charge of the Navy, was put, after doing the stuff he did in World War I, he was put in charge of the college and training future officers. It's a fun thing. For the Japanese, it's actually quite a few different officers are involved. But when you start to look at them, and I'm going to make poor Leslie's head explode, because I know he's our resident person who specialises in looking up Yonai, you find that pretty much all of them are being protected or in a certain extent under the auspices of the then Chief of the 3rd Section of the IJN General Staff, Rear Admiral Mitsumasa Yonai. We are talking about Mitsumasa Yonai is, the guy who's also looking after Yamato. He's looking after so many of the senior officers of Japan who we associate as being some of their best officers come up under his auspices. Is actually almost disturbing. And I mean that in the nicest possible way, but this guy is definitely protecting them and helping them grow up. And these 3 officers are seeking different things. You have existing global power trying to preserve its dominance on the world in a treaty system. You have emerging global power trying to assert and grow and understand its dominance on the world system. You have major regional power / world power who is trying to figure out exactly how to secure their position in the world. That's the differences, and that affects their different approaches to these things, because what do you want from your task forces in this scenario? For Britain, for British Empire, task forces are about holding areas, about controlling areas of the ocean, and with what vessels you have in the area, no matter what they are, and having a very fluid and flexible doctrine which reflects that, until a fleet arrives, until the Mediterranean fleet arrives, until the home fleet arrives. Until one of the fleets arrives, the task forces have to hold the area. They'll be made of whatever forces available in the area, whatever station they can be grabbed from, whatever dominion they can come from. They'll be grabbed, put together. That's their job. So you've got to have a task force doctrine which is going to bring those things together. For Sims, the challenge is he's got to sell sea power to the US public and the US Congress. And those are not the same discussions. Anyone who believes it's the same discussion to sell sea power as a capability to the public, as to sell it to the political class, are ignoring the reality. The reality is, to an extent, you can force things on politicians. You can force them to study stuff by keep posing questions to them. By keep sitting them in situations where they're going to look stupid if they don't have an answer. So at least their staff start studying it so they can give them answers. So therefore, at least you therefore have some form of informed decision-making process going to take place. For the public, this is going to sound terrible, but for the public, what matters is the first 8 words. We want 8, and we won't wait. 6 words. We want 8, And we won't wait. Actually, 7 words. 7 words. Less than 8 words. It's a nice, catchy slogan. Now, the thing is, some people think that all people hear, oh, you need is a catchy slogan, and that wins you the debate. That's not really winning the debate. What happens is the catchy slogan gets you in the door. The catchy slogan, people pick up on and go, what are they talking about? People are busy. People have families. They have jobs. They have lots of things they're trying to do with their time. Sometimes they'll have an inordinately warm fridge which they're sitting next to them. Lots of things which will distract them and keep them focused on their own lives. If you want to break through that, you need a slogan that will make them want to get out of that rut and see and peer around and see what's going on. So for one, you need questions. For another, you need a slogan. And for both of them, you then need a well-reasoned argument structure for them to go find and actually read through. And so, Sims is tasked with building a navy in this scenario. And he's taking his approach to Task Force Doctrine is training officers to be able to think in task forces, to war game, to think not just about, I'm a cruiser officer, I need to know cruisers. I'm a destroyerman, I need to know destroyers. To think about, okay, so I've got this many cruisers, this many destroyers, how do I command them? Trouble is, Alliance, we want 16 doesn't really work as a slogan. We want 8. We won't wait. Is nicely alliterative. Yeah. Alliterative. Tongue is not helping me today. And so, Sims is working through that. Sims is working from the point of view of, if I train the officers, they can start working on this. If I train these officers, they will be able to talk to the journalists who will ask the questions of the politicians. They will be able to talk to newspapers, which will start the slogans. I can't do this myself. But if I have a really well-trained officer corps that understand it, there's going to be people in them who can. And that's what he's promoting. That's what he's working through. Yonai's trouble is he has to deal with a fleet which is very comfortable. Very, very comfortable. Let's be honest, let's look at the Japanese fleet in 1920s. What are they saying? They won the Russo-Japanese War with their existing doctrine. They got through World War I with their existing doctrine, and they did very well for themselves. Remember, we're talking about a fleet which doesn't have to start massively growing its naval aviation or its aviation section, so doesn't get into the idea that that pilots have to be more than just knights of the air, these superstars. We talk about the reason why the Japanese in World War II are always struggling to have enough pilots because, because of their own training system, their own program for training, generating pilots, and their organization of them. Well, that's because their system has been has evolved from their pre-World War I system, and it worked, so they've just kept adapting and evolving that system. They haven't been confronted with a scenario where they were short of pilots and they needed to think it over again, or when they were going, oh, we need a lot more aircraft. They hadn't had that. Japan comes out of World War I, and World War I for them is an incredibly positive experience. And this builds on the rest of the Japanese War, which had been an incredibly positive experience. They had won. And that's the point. It's very hard to tell people who have won and who think therefore they are exceptional and are brilliant that we need to evolve. We need to start adapting to the situation we're in. How do you understand? That we need to be actually different than we are now. That's an incredibly difficult task. That's what UNI has to try and do. That's what the officers around him have to try and do. And that's a problem. Because if you're in a scenario where people are naturally going to be quite prideful, quite proud of what they did, and you're basically telling them, you did great, that went well, but future warfare is going to be different. And we're going to need to evolve to adapt it. You're going to have to make a very big case. For Britain, it's an easy one. We have to protect the entire empire. So we need to have a doctrine which reflects that with the force structure we have available. That's an easy case to make. There is a reason why the Royal Navy, despite the issues it has in many ways in the 1920s and 30s, never has an issue with getting funding for testing or training. They can train like nutters and they can test like wackos. This is why their systems work in World War II. Not because their systems are better in terms of their technology or anything like that. No, if anyone makes that claim, they're being silly. What they are, though, is a lot more well tested because they have the budget for it. Because the British are able to go, we have to defend this whole frigating empire. We have to make sure these systems work in the South Atlantic, in the North Atlantic, in the Indian Ocean, in the Pacific. We can't do that if we do one test back in the UK. And if the British government even tries to go, oh well, we think it works in theory. Do you know what they do? They leak it to Malta, they leak it to Australia, they leak it to the Dominions, and then the Dominions then yell at the British government at the next Imperial conference. And the testing gets done. That is the advantage they have. That's also the curse they have to deal with. For America, they can have money for exercises. It's really weird. Congress are prepared to give them money for exercises, but not for testing. They're prepared to give them money for theoretical testing exercise as well. But they don't want them to buy ships. They're never getting enough ships. They will build cruisers. Begrudgingly, but they'll build them. Not that many, though. They'll build capital ships. They'll build carriers. You try and get them to build destroyers. And as said, for UNI, the challenge is, we already work. Our system is already great. Why do we need to change it? And that is always a problem. Why do we need to change it? Because it isn't that great? Because there are problems? Because what it looks like, whilst it looks like it works on the moment, it doesn't actually have that actual great thing going on? I would say that's the hardest job of all. You know. Let's see, Yano is protecting the lot of officers from the radicalization lower ranks, as well as protecting them from the old guard stuck in the muds. Yes, Yano is basically... Yano is one of those characters who I would love to see more published about him in Western literature, because he is nowhere near studied enough. He is one of those great leaders and great people in the early 20th century who really has a massive impact on not just Japan, but the world around Japan, and he's forgotten. Yonai, you're going to fight an industrial war against the Americans, and we probably can't win if we try in a new way. We definitely can't the old way. Please stop. Yeah. It's he is a fantastic character. But this is actually the comparison. I would like to see a book which compares these three officers and their impacts on their service. I would love to see it. But I don't think you'll ever get one. Because one of the things is, when I'm looking up Yonai, I have to read between the lines a lot for him. Because the Japanese really haven't written a lot down on it. You wish they would. You wish they'd write more down. But they didn't. They didn't write more down. And also, it's a case of... all three of these officers don't really give a hoot about who gets the credit, just as long as it gets done. And that's always a problem. As a historian, tracking down officers like that, most of the best officers, most of the best civil servants, even some of the best politicians, you don't give a flying hoot about who gets the credit. They care that the job gets done. And so sometimes it becomes quite difficult to track down what they were involved in and what they did, because it's credited to other people. And then you look around and go, it couldn't have been that person, because they have nowhere near the breadth of information. You look at their other writing and their other people, the stuff they're doing, they are nowhere near involved in this. And that's kind of fun, so sometimes. Because then you get to go, okay, so who was really the officer behind this? If it can't have been these officers, who was it? It feels like a Henderson type, yes. Remember, upon his honour as an officer of the Royal Navy, HMS Unicorn was not to be an aircraft carrier. She was a forward aviation support ship. Upon his honour. That is a great line. That is a great line. And you're right, Leslie. She was. It's also the fact that she was used as a template for the light fleet carriers will leave to one side. So, the British development. I'm going to stick the articles. Now that we got to them, what I'm going to do, and this is the reason I've kept things open, is I'm going to stick links to these articles in the thing below. So, if you are watching this back later, or even watching this now on YouTube, I can't do this in Twitch, you will find a notes section appearing. And every time we go to one of these slides, I'm going to add to the notes. So the notes should appear, if you refresh the screen, all these links should appear. So, British development of Task Force Doctrine. It's kind of fundamentally working together and working out how they're going to get the fleet to work together in smaller groups around the world. It starts off looking at and focusing in quite heavily on how you continue on from the Harwich Force, but add in aircraft. The first task forces they're really looking at are things which are aircraft carriers, cruisers, and destroyers. Later on, they start adding in larger formations of other options. but they are working it through. And as I said, the point they're looking for, and the point they're really focusing on, is adaptability. What do I mean by adaptability? The British have a nightmare scenario, and they train for it a lot. Their nightmare scenario is not war against the United States. That is something they do theorize, the same with the Americans theorizing them, because that is the worst fleet for them to end up fighting, individual fleet, because it is the same size as them. So of course you have exercises inferior things to test out the ideas, because that's also therefore the best training scenario, because if you're training to fight the Americans and you find yourself fighting the French, life's a lot easier. But that wasn't the nightmare scenario for the British. First off, it was the Japanese and the Italians. That starts in the 1920s. So later in the 1930s, the Germans get added to that mix. Basically, the idea is, though, that you end up with a war going on in at least 2 or 3 parts of the British Empire at the same time, and you're against fairly major forces, so you have to require large chunks of your fleet. Now, the thing is, they know they're not going to have enough fleet to be everywhere. Think about that. We're talking about, in the 1920s and 30s, and for most of the 1940s, the world's largest navy. And they were starting from a fundamental understanding that they would not have enough ships to be everywhere they needed to be in certain war scenarios. They couldn't deploy a squadron of battleships here, there, and everywhere. They couldn't deploy an entire squadron of carriers. They couldn't deploy all the cruisers they wanted, all the destroyers they wanted. So Task Force Doctrine becomes about working out, what do you need? What do you need to be a effective force control? And they also put this around, what do you need to deal with surface raiders? And very quickly the idea comes that what you basically need is you need a carrier, which is able to provide you with reconnaissance and strike, and air defense on a good day. Remember, much of this is pre-radar being implemented, so it's a case of it's air defense on a good day, because it's got to be airborne and they've got to do visual intercepts. So yeah, it's not radar guided intercept, it's visual guided intercept, and that's a very different ballpark. And then on top of that, you need a capital ship. At least one. Now the problem becomes that immediately in that scenario, your carrier and your capital ship are going to define your speed of your task force. The faster the task force can go, the better. Randomly, and here is the interesting thing, the King George V's are more designed around being task force ships than the Lions and even Vanguard. Why? Why are they why are KGVs more designed around being task force ships than Lions and Vanguard? Lions are designed realistically around being potentially solo operators, which can join in task groups, but also can be a fairly good fast battle line when they need to be in a hunting pack. Lions are designed around the idea that there are some quite large ships coming along being built by the Germans, the Italians, and the Japanese, and the Soviets, and a realization that you're going to need the heavy muscle. King George V's are 28-knot ships, which makes them perfectly fine for a task force in this period, which Lions has pointed out in the chat. But also, with their 10-14-inch guns and the way they're laid out, they can quite literally use the forward battery to engage one target and the aft battery to engage another. And if you've got 4 guns in the aft, there is a very real thing. If you're being chased, you can match the probably 4 guns of 2 twins that most ships currently in service and potentially being built at that time period. Most ships, not all ships, there are some of which are building with 6 guns, you can match and range in on them. In other words, there is an argument for the quadruple turrets with the task force structure. I need to work on this chair. Although, I will note, someone said the other day they knew that this video was not II, my videos were not II, because the square cheeked. The chair squeaked. If it didn't squeak, they'd think it was AI. And also going, really? The accent, the general mannerisms, the pace of delivery, none of those were a clue? It was the chair squeaking? It's fun. But if you start thinking that through, and you start thinking structures, we've got Force K, we've got Force H, we've got a lot of forces in World War II where the British are sealing up Gibraltar, sealing up all things, which are using this force structure. So why are they picking that? Why are they picking this force? Well, also because that's enough force that you have to think about it to take it out. Having a single capital ship means you have to bring a capital ship to the fight. Because if you just bring cruisers to a fight with an enemy capital ship, and it's a fast capital ship, or it's Nelson and Rodney, or something like that, they are going to whip your behind in the nicest way. Nelson and Rodney, or the King George V's, even Hood, or Renown. Any cruiser decides to go start tangling with them, that is around in 1939, 1940, 1941, is going to learn very quickly that the meaning of, ouch, they did it again. Having cruisers with you as well means that no, there cannot be a pack of cruisers to come and engage it, because some of those cruisers are going to end up fighting cruisers as well. Having destroyers means you've got protection, you've got the force screened against submarines, against air attack, against surface attack, so they've got a screening. And a carrier provides them with the ability to see what's coming and adjust. So if you are bringing a fleet to deal with them, the carrier will hopefully see them coming a long way away, and you can skedaddle out of there. This is the reality. The British Task Force Doctrine is about holding positions. As much as you can hold them at sea. It's about holding areas of water. It's about the denial of operations and control to the enemy. It's really interesting because the British are going for a denial system which is not based on the concept of mines or torpedo boats. It's based on the concept of a task force doctrine. It's based on as Adam Carrier has just pointed out, a balanced force structure. Now, this then, interestingly enough, comes into today's structure. Because I would argue that if we start talking about the Trump-class battleship and those things, if we look at the actual concept behind it, the large escort which the US Navy are going for, what they are looking for is the capability to hold areas of ocean. Not just eventually take them, but hold them. And the thing is, if you have something of that status, of that level of firepower, the number of missiles it can carry, if it's nuclear powered, the lasers and systems it can support, etc., you raise that level again. You raise the level of threat that you need to deal with that much higher. To the point at which it becomes a question of, can I economically deal that force and that force, or do I have to pick which one I fight? Now, Does that make it necessarily a good idea? I would still say it could be useful, but again, it's how it's used and how it's built and how that structures into the general American construction. But there is a rationale behind it. The fact it's being badly explained, and you sometimes have to look at the rationale coming out of the US Navy and the US Department of Defense and the various discussions and go, oh, you're trying to say that, but you're using a really weird way of saying it. Probably because, in the nicest way, the idea of the US Navy being about holding water rather than taking water is quite disturbing. But yeah. Are you saying that it makes more sense for to have a cruiser tank of a cruiser while a carrier hits 30-4 knots and runs? Yes. That's pretty much... That is... Literally, there's a classic example of this. During World War II, at one point, Ark Royal, Renown and Force H are running along. There are a couple of Italian capital ships coming up behind them. What happens? Renown, cruiser, I think it's Shiny at Sheffield, basically go, salute to Ark Royal. Destroyers and Ark Royal carry on. Renown, Sheffield start to fall back, going... So, right then, you guys aren't getting past us. You might kill us, but you aren't getting past us. Italians decide that, frankly, the idea of, A, tangling Renown and Sheffield is never going to be a good day. They'll probably win, because they're battleships, but the trouble is, they are going to take damage doing it. And 2... Ark Royal's now going to be far enough away, there are going to be aircraft launching aircraft coming in at the same time. So they're going to be under air attack while fighting Renown and Sheffield. And 3, they're not quite sure where the British submarines are. So they decide they would prefer not to be there. By the way, fairly certain Ark Royal wouldn't have run if she didn't want to have space to launch aircraft. After all, as we know full well from HMS Formidable, if the enemy's only a cruiser, we stay and engage. But the point is, there is a doctrine here. The British know what they're doing. They know what's expected of them. And it's, again, one of the other interesting things, the advantage the British have, and this is an advantage which actually, again, leads into why they would not be a navy which would come in with a numbered system the Americans do. They get to practice this a lot. They have a lot of time to practice this. They have a lot of exercises. You know, the Royal Navy basically does an exercise almost twice a year where they basically bring the home fleet to the Mediterranean because the weather's easier to have an exercise in, you can more reliably have it. But sometimes they bring the Mediterranean fleet to the home fleet, to the Irish Sea or North Sea or the North Atlantic, and they basically go ding ding ding, fleets fight, and whoever wins gets some paid holiday and some lovely other lovely stuff. Usually large, quite copious amounts of alcohol. Why do that? Because this is how you try and train your force to fight. So the British, by the time it gets to the 1940s, World War II, have a huge depth of officers who are used to this. Who are used to this kind of fighting. Who are used to this idea of these disparate operations. Then we get to the Americans. Now, the Americans are fun. The American Task Force Doctrine is very fun because the American Task Force Doctrine is in many ways as much written to take advantage, to make the best of the realities of the American situation, as it is written to give them a good doctrine in operations. What do I mean by this? The Americans know that they're going to be in a scenario where in any war that comes in, they're going to have to rapidly and massively expand their navy. They're going to have to massively reorganize their force, and they're going to have to realistically deal with a lot of issues which are coming in. And that's going to be a problem. That is going to be a real problem. Because, how do I put this politely? For the Americans, they know that naval warfare is building strategy. That naval warfare strategy is build strategy. They know they can't build enough in peacetime. They know they're not going to get the huge amount of ships they need to build in peacetime. They're never going to get the funding out of Congress until war basically hits. So in many ways, they're building up a task force doctrine with those numbers to and then that number structure to make it easier to administer, because everyone knows in that position who's in charge of whom. They know who's senior to who. So that means you can actually take advantage of having a relatively smaller pool of very well trained officers to run it. Because you're going to have a lot of officers who are wartime service only, a lot of officers who are coming into service on relatively short commissions or relatively quickly commissioned. You're going to have a lot of officers who might have the experience, but might not who you normally would choose to be in charge of things, because they've got the experience, so therefore they're better than nothing, and the other options, but they're not who you normally would want to put in charge. You're going to need to structure all that into a way that works. Into a formation which gives you the ability to operate. And that is problematic. That is really problematic. And really difficult to do. And with that being the case, you have to come up with a doctrine which can reflect and deal with that. So when we talk about the American doctrine, people often talk about it as being adaptable. It is. They talk about a task force doctrine fitting in a lot with the logistics and the infrastructure they have available. It does. What they often really want to ignore is that it is also a way of, in many ways, weaponizing the weaknesses of the US Navy at this point. And the weakness of the US Navy are not the US Navy's personnel, they're its number of personnel. They're not its ships, they're its number of ships. They're not itself, it's the size of the Navy relative to the tasking that's going to be expected of it. The Admiral's flag will be on his flagship, or her flagship. Doesn't matter whether it's a carrier or a capital ship. Whichever one is his flagship gets the flag. Now, for the Americans, there are some interesting scenarios going on as well in this. In that, when you start realizing you're building these things and this capability, you have to start asking yourself, okay, where am I going to put this capability? What am I building this capability for? What's this capability going to deliver? And that is always something they have to think about. Always something they have to watch. So for the Americans, it's very much about force generation. It's very much about command and control. It's very much about everyone knowing how to be in a force who might not have that enough experience of being in the force. And in many ways, the US Navy actually doesn't study the Royal Navy for this. This is one of the things. I read some books that go, oh, the US Navy was studying the Royal Navy for this. No, they weren't. The US Navy looked at the Royal Navy and realised what they missed. The Royal Navy in World War I, World War II is pulling from a huge formation, not just of the regulars, but also the reserves. They have the Royal Navy Volunteer Reserve, they have the Royal Naval Reserve, they have huge reserve organisations. They have a whole load of former officers who were got rid of by the Geeds Acts, who were then put back into reserve positions and were able to be called up in the beginning of World War II. They had huge depth in terms of strength at captain rank and below, in terms of senior officer, experienced officers. And they had, I've talked about them, there are officers who were admirals, who come back into the Royal Navy service and take the rank of commander, or go back and become convoy commodores, or all sorts of things, because that's what you do. It's one of the interesting things. The Royal Navy is often short in some regards of senior officers. They do have an admiral shortage in terms of serving senior admirals at certain points in World War II, because they've lost so many due to dying in the late 1930s because of overwork and various other things. But they are never short of captains. They are never short of experienced officers to build crews around. And therefore those officers can operate in task forces quite easily. And they all know where they fit in those roles, and what they can do and what they can't do, and how they can work. The US is not in the same place. So the US needs to make everything as formulaic and straightforward as possible, so that it's easy for people to learn and adapt into. The fact that that also makes it very administratively easy and organised is a benefit. It's a feature, not a bug. But again, this doesn't mean they necessarily come in perfectly. One of the fun things with the Americans is they very quickly adapt some of their task force ideas. Some of their task force structures were meant to be far more homogeneous. Some of their ideas were far more convoluted than they necessarily needed to be. A lot of the finer points they put together worked really well in exercises, didn't work well in practice. And that's fine. These things happen. You know, it not working in practice is perfectly acceptable. Because if you haven't had that many exercises to test it, and the exercises when you have been doing, you have to remember, the exercises which did take place often involved the US Navy officers as they were in Imperial service, and it was they're all professionals, and then after they've expanded it, it turns out that some of the assumptions professionals had about the people they were expanding it to don't work out. Don't work out is sometimes a bit of an understatement, but yeah. But again, it's the classic thing of, think about this. I've talked about this before. I will change the examples I give and the way I structure things, sometimes depending on the audience I'm talking to. You know, if I'm talking to a master's class full of people who are, let's say, industry professionals, and they're doing their masters, and it's international relations, they're all loaded diplomats. The examples I will give will tend to be based on diplomatic events, and something which speaks to that audience, because it's their frame of reference. It's an easier thing to work. If I'm speaking to an audience which is made up of, let's say, regular history lovers, because there's probably going to be a few people there who don't love history being dragged by their partner, but they will probably be in the minority, hopefully, of the group. Otherwise, I feel very sorry for them. But, you know, so if I'm speaking to all those general history lovers, and it's a general group, I will often use sporting metaphors and analogies. Why? Because most people in the room will understand, will have more of a frame of reference when it comes to sporting analogy than they will to a random diplomatic event that took place 25 years ago. Or 40 years ago. In that scenario. Why am I bringing this up as a point? The thing about the American development, the American doctrine, is it's written a lot by naval officers, US naval officers, who are thinking about how they would act. And in some ways, even though they are what they're assuming, they're often assuming that the people who are going to be drawn in are less capable naval officers rather than people who are, I don't know, merchant marine officers who are now naval officers, or engineers who are now acting as naval officers. They're thinking of when they're designing their doctrine, they're often, and even realizing the issues they have, they're often thinking about the people as still being naval officers first, and not naval officer second. They still think they're going to have the same frames of reference. And that's things they do need to, they find that often are the ones which create the issues. That's often where they have to run into the problems. 90-day wonders. Not really that so much. But also the other problem they have is that they are sometimes presuming, because let's be honest, most ships officers, they usually, most officers you're going to be dealing with in World War II, they're going to be 1939 necessarily relatively junior, and they're going to be rapidly promoted up because they've got some experience. But that's the other problem. Because this tends to be written by officers who were on the fast track, who were on the line to promotion, and not all officers were on the line to promotion. And as Mark Hunter says, we need something that can guide rather than relying on years of experience. Relying on years of experience and relying on the fact that every officer was as absolutely focused on a naval officer's career as the people who are writing it. Because let's be honest, the people who are writing it were the naval geeks. There's no other way to describe it. They were the naval geeks. Not the naval enthusiasts, the naval geeks. And as much as I love it, I'm a naval history geek. I admit this. I'm quite proud. I would presume a large majority of my audience are in some way or other geeks. There is the fact that when you are really geeky over a topic, you can end up writing something which basically other geeks in topic will really, really enjoy, and enthusiasts will go, I know about 70% of this, I can sort of follow this, but that looks like it could be written in Klingon, and I don't speak Klingon. It's jumped off completely. And the reason is, you've got so trucked into your passion, you've forgotten it's going to be read by people who might not be as passionate about it as you are. And that is a trouble. That's one of the things I do sometimes find out with journal articles when I see that, when I'm currently reviewing one at the moment. And it's well written. But in sections, they have got so passionate about that topic that even for me, who is probably the other person who knows that topic, hence been sent to me to be reviewed, which means they know if they're watching the channel, they'll know exactly who they are, know exactly, because literally there's only two of us who publish on this sort of thing, so they know exactly, and they would have guessed it would have been sent to me and reviewed anyway. They'll know exactly what I'm saying, because they'll get this back in writing, and I would have told them to the face. There are sections where they have got so passionate and infused with their argument that honestly, it's kind of lost its its internal logic. It's making jumps. And whilst they are probably analytical leaps, they don't have enough of a run-up foundation to support the jumps in them at the moment because they've got they're focused in their passion. One value of AI is the coding stuff that is above your pay grade. Yeah, sometimes AI works as a translator of what is this person saying to me. It's kind of like, as I've talked about this before when I talked about academia. I've talked about how there are some professors who are so far down the research hole in their topic, you do not let them anywhere near first years. Because when they are talking, the first years will have no frame of reference to understand them, because what they are talking about, let's say, or an English language university, will not really sound English because it's full of so many what I call subject-specific linguistics and phraseologies and theories. And as Seneca Nearest pointed out, the experts will overestimate the amount of stuff that the average person knows about the subject they're expert in. The average German barely knows about the high seas. I know. This is why some people don't like my channels and my books, because I always start off from the basis of, okay, there are going to be some people who are watching this channel who have never seen anything about naval history before and possibly never read anything, and they've just clicked on it because they thought the title looked interesting and they're bored, or it's auto run on. So I'm going to try and explain everything from from foundation level up, so that they can follow and they will hopefully get into the topic. I have been accused occasionally in comments of people going, "You are talking down to your audience." I'm going, no. I am presuming that people watching might have no background knowledge. And as you go further in the video, I go further up the tree, hopefully building up each layer. That's why I try and structure it. This is the trouble with them. It's on the American doctrine. It is a very good doctrine. It is a very well thought through, many ways, doctrine. But sometimes it is not a best presented doctrine. There are many people who use way too much jargon. Joe Frederick, it's easy to forget. Task Force is a relatively recent invention. Corps is a Napoleonic one. Task Force, as I was talking about, basically, the thing about task forces is task forces themselves are not a recent invention. There have been task forces around for a long time. Again, Napoleonic Wars, navies were using task forces. What the Americans have developed, and what I tried to talk about, is this numerical system. So, it's not so much task force doctrine as it's the Americans' adaptation of task force doctrine into a codified, numericized system. Does that make sense? Because it's not so much task forces. There's been task force doctrine around for a long time in terms of using task forces, using these ad hoc groups on structures. But what the Americans provided is this structure to it. And I'm carrying, it's like business meetings where people start throwing around acronyms without ever defining acronyms. Yes, I find that really annoying. And I'm the person who sometimes, even if I know what the acronym means, will go, "Hello, can you please explain that acronym so we can all be sure we're talking on the same subject? We're on the same wavelength. Can you please?" Because literally, I will get to a certain point where they have used it when it has come in more than once. If it's just once in passing, I'll ignore it. Twice, I'm going, hang on. The third time, no explanation yet? Okay, hand going up. Ah, yes, Thomas. This is the sort of thing is often most seen when a programmer writes a manual for the use of their tool. The manual assumes knowledge users of the things they don't have. Yeah. That is it. That is exactly it, and that's exactly what we're talking about, really. That's literally the people writing this doctrine were the people who were the programmers of the US Navy, and they presumed everyone else in the US Navy would have the same level of understanding. And some areas they do, some areas they don't. That's the reality of it. But it's still good doctrine, as I said, and the whole system is set up. It provides command structure. It also makes it logistically easy, because you know exactly, down to quite a granular level. Okay, Task Force 38.1.2.3 needs this supplies. Okay, you can do it. Lance, the concept was going on for a very long time. The Americans were the first ones to formalize it into our current understanding, is what I'm understanding. Pretty much. In how we sort of modernize use it. They're the first ones to bring together the decimalization, as I said, of task forcing. I usually describe it as the numerizing or decimalization of task forcing, when you've got the point system and etc. and these things. And so it's kind of an interesting thing in that regards, because it's very easy to go, oh, so what are we talking about? Because if you go with the policy of the Americans invented completely, then you look at Force K and Force H and go, well, are they task forces? The British treat them as such. So hang on, the British set those and got those operating, and that's been part of British doctrine for quite a while. And you start going backwards, and said to Nelson and all those things. What the Americans bring to it is this idea of, okay, how do we make this system fit us? And fit our likely to rapidly expand Navy for future taskings. We've got to have a system which actually is easy for people to use. And it works. And that then leads us to the Japanese. And the Japanese development, these are going to be a lot of links, which are suddenly going to appear below. Let's go to this button and put them in. And again, you should find it in the links all below in the description. You should. And they should all be there now. So if you update the screen, you should find links to all these below. So there's lots and lots of links today, and this is one of the things again I've provided in this video, and there'll be even more links added in when I do the there's this one. The Land Frustrator. Here, hi there. I have a question that's unrelated to discussion. Where's the best place when you send a question in? Put the question into the Q&A, and I'll do it at the end. The Q&A is open. The bot is open, taking in the questions. So, that should send the results. There you go. There we go. It produced itself. It worked. We're sending a rune on somewhere. Right. So Japanese development. The Japanese is some of the most complicated in some ways, but also some of the most sensible. So the Japanese development is inexorably linked to their attrition strategy. Now, as you know, I have talked about this a lot. I have talked a lot about the Kantai-Kessen, but also about the other results, the other systems that the Japanese have, and the other doctrines they have coming through. And it's one of those things which gets forgotten at certain points, you know. The big ship, big guns strategy, which Taika and Kyosugi, which drives a lot of their warship development, it's nothing to do with the Kantai-Kessen. The Japanese attrition doctrine, which for some reason my notes on it, which I have on the screen, I have already uploaded, aren't opening. Zengen Sakusen, which is basically the thing which is the most important part of their doctrine. And this is what's driving a lot of their task forces, the idea of the attrition warfare. And the reason why they're going with task force structure for this is because they know they're going to have to be ad hoc forces. Whereas for the decisive battle, you would have your forces grouped up properly, you'd have a whole fleet action, it would be a fleet of war, a fleet operation. It is a scenario where the reality is, for the attrition operations, they are mostly going to be conducted by ad hoc groups, by destroyers, by cruisers, by carrier aircraft. They're going to be a task force doctrine. Joe Fredericks, I've heard some people argue that the raid on Pearl Harbor was conducted by a task force, but since the attackers are mostly the first air fleet, does it even count? Yes and no. It is a task force, but it's the Keto Battalion reinforced by other units. It is a task force doctrine, but it is a task force in the sense of it's not a fleet. It's the first air fleet being supported by other systems, but it is also kind of not. It's kind of a fleet because it's self-sufficient. So it's more a fleet strike than necessarily a task force strike. But the thing is, as I've said before, the difference between a task force and a fleet is theoretically supposed to be a self-sustaining organization, whereas a task force is a self-sustaining formation. There's the difference. Fleet is a self-sustaining organization. Fleet will have access to infrastructure, industry, and other structures to support it. Task forces don't have that. Now, yeah, there's a really cool doctoral thesis there. I just want to really highlight that. That's the second link from Bomb. That comes from the Hong Kong Baptist University. Worth a read. And there's actually a paper which is about the Italian impact on Japanese doctrine, which is also worth a read. The Japanese are... So, within the framework of the Japanese doctrinal analysis and attrition operations, which of course their idea is to attrit the Americans as they dance across, or attrit the British forces as they come up towards Japan. They wish to attrit them, i.e. weaken them, to the point at which they are a force that is of equivalent or maybe even slightly lesser strength than their main fleet, bring in their main fleet, fight a decisive battle, and then dictate peace. It is Greeks versus Romans, okay? I know people hate me saying that, because they say, I've had someone write a nice long comment saying that me talking about it being Greeks versus Romans, it's cultural appropriation. It's not, it's cultural similarities. The Greeks had a history, especially after Alexander the Great and Macedonia and all those things had been sort of disappeared off doing other things. And the Macedonian Empire had broken up into many different states. The Greeks had a scenario where they used to have a big battle, and then they would have a negotiation afterwards, and the people who won the battle would have the whip hand at the negotiations. That was the way it went. When they fought the Romans, challenged the Romans to war and ended up fighting the Romans, they won the first battle. And they thought, that's great, we've won, let's have a negotiation. The Romans didn't send a load of diplomats, though. The Romans sent some more legions. What the frig's going on here? They fought another battle. They did quite well. Still hadn't decisively won this time, but they've done quite well. Okay, we're going to negotiate now. No, the Romans send more legions. And eventually the Greek states get annihilated and get worn down and become basically the Romans' puppets. All well and good. All done. But that was the thing. The Japanese strategy, because they couldn't fight a long-term war, their only hope was to attrit, fight battle, get some sort of negotiated peace. Because if the British or the Americans didn't negotiate, that would mean the British and Americans would come back with another round of fleet. And another round of fleet. And another round of fleet. And the thing is, the Japanese didn't have the infrastructure they could ever deal with that. The Japanese could give a very good go against the first fleet they fight. They couldn't really deal with the second, and they knew they had no chance against the third. John Fredericks, I was mostly taught then in terms of harassing operations, it'd mostly be by task force, i.e. ad hoc formations. Once a decisive battle is fought, it'll mostly be a fleet organisation. Yeah, that's pretty much what I've been saying, hopefully. And that's what they're trying to do. And this is the reality of what they're facing. And what the Japanese are facing. So, when they're talking about their task force doctrine, and it comes out a lot later on in World War II, when they are running short of units, their task force doctrine is around attrition operations. It's around maximizing the flexibility for attrition. So it actually kind of pushes command and control down quite low. It's kind of interesting, Japanese doctrine. The task force doctrine is probably the one which entrusts the most to junior officers. And what I mean by junior officers, I mean ship commanders. It's really weird to be calling a ship's commander a junior officer. But the Japanese, as I've talked about with their ranks before and the way they approach ranks, it comes from a very different school of thought than necessarily Western ranks. And the Western rank structure. And I did an entire video which was on the various rank structures and explained all these things. So I'm not going into too much detail now. But if you want to go see it, go look up the rank structure videos. You will find it in my videos collection. Go use Jack Ray's very useful website, which he's put out together about the whole channel. It's very useful. You can find all sorts of things. You can search there and look up Japanese ranks, and it'll give you the various videos where I discuss it in. And the main one and the subsidiaries. And the thing is, what you have going on for the Japanese instance is that they have what they call trainee senior officers, basically. Their equivalent of rear admiral, it almost translates as trainee admiral. As in, we're not sure we trust this person yet to be an admiral, but they are better than the other options, so we're going to train them up, and we're going to give them limited command. This is why you find in Japanese command operations, you'll find a lot of things being run by vice admirals, which would be in US or Royal Navy be run by commodores or rear admirals. Now, occasionally, they use other more junior officers. Occasionally they do. But it's not really their habit. To a certain extent, the Japanese are still stuck in the Edwardian Royal Navy. But when you start talking about their attrition operations and their task force operations, they're expecting a lot out of their captains. They're expecting a lot of thinking about them. So they train a lot in them. Again, this is one of the interesting things. When you start to consider their night fighting tactics, their approach to long-range combat with their torpedoes, their approach to a lot of the destroyer warfare, it comes from their attrition operations, as is their task force doctrine. And so when they're talking about task forces, they are also, in many ways, almost recreating the Harwich Force. They are cruisers and destroyers. That's what they're thinking about. They're thinking about cruisers and destroyers as combined. They're not necessarily thinking about what happens if we have carriers in. Well, we're going to have multiple carriers if we have carriers in, so it's going to be a carrier force which is being supported. We're going to have capital ships. We're going to have basically a fleet. It's not a higher level task. They're not talking about task forces like the Royal Navy for holding areas with a capital ship, a carrier, and some cruisers and some destroyers. They are talking about a force which is put together to act and carry out offensive operations. And in that regards, mostly in terms of night fighting. In that regards, that's what they're focused on. So, Japanese development is interesting. It's very much a product of what are they trying to do. And one of the problems you also have is that there is a large chunk of Japanese admirals who are going, but you have to stay in fleet formation, but you have to stay in this, but. And the other problem for this whole scenario, realistically, and I do mean problem for this scenario realistically, is that Mitsumasa Yonai is dealing with problems from both sides. He's got the radicalization effects of the various political movements in Japan, causing trouble for junior officers, and trying to kill off junior officers who are not actively participating or are not seen to be the right shade of aggression. And he's got senior officers who are going, but this system already works, why do we need to change it? And then he's got the scenario whereby, doctrinally, there is only one area where task forces really fit. Because, let's be honest, as I said, the Kantai Kessen is a full fleet operation. It's going to be the full fleet. It's going to be the full combined fleet operations. Therefore, that's what needs to be running it. It's going to be the combined fleet. It's going to be the senior seagoing admiral of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Because that's who the commander of the combined fleet is de facto. There might be others who theoretically outrank them, but in reality, the commander of the combined fleet is the commander of the combined fleet. It's kind of like when we start talking about Strike Fleet Atlantic. Okay? If Strike Fleet Atlantic is turning up, that's who's in charge in NATO. Others can be going, but I'm the senior admiral. Doesn't matter. Strike Fleet Atlantic is the boss. Strike Fleet Atlantic turns up with all those ships, all those capabilities, and all the doctrine behind them. They're in charge. It's the same with the commander of the combined fleet. And that means that also, how do I put this, cuts off rather a lot of your thinking, because if you're only thinking about task force operations in terms of what are we conducting in terms of attrition warfare, when you have to have units which are operating independently and without maybe making much radio noise because that would give away their position, that is difficult. That requires you to spread the commands out. But for amphibious warfare, for the Kantai Kessen, for all these things, a lot of the stuff is going to go through the combined fleet. So that's who's going to run it. Which then leads us to the run up to World War II. So, here is the thing. When we start talking about task forces, the Royal Navy have what I call the alphabetical task forces in 1930s. So, the Royal Navy has got an alphabetized task force system. The US Navy is going for a numericized task force system. And that's where we consider the modern one comes in from. The Royal Navy has eight groups, forces, F, G, H, I, K, L, M, and N, and G. H and K are hunting the South Atlantic under overall command of Admiral George Doyle, then in CNC South Atlantic, and Force K is the centre point. Force K is Renown, Ark Royal, and Hardy, Hostile, Hereward, and Hasty. Now you might go, Alex, there's no destroyers. No cruisers. I mean, there's no cruisers. There's only H-class destroyers, there's no cruisers. Sorry, brain fart. And the point is, they are making hay to high speed to the River Plate, where there is Commodore Harwood and his entire unit squad of cruisers. There is a 8-inch gun county down there. There are some lovely little sort of Leanders down there as well, Ajax and Achilles. Yes, Exodus had to head home, but Cumberland's there, and so there's the cruisers. And again, this is something which the British are happy to do. They're happy to have a scenario where the cruisers are part of the South Atlantic Division of, the South Atlantic Division, Commodore Harwood's South Atlantic Division, which is a regular standing formation. But there's also forces. And this is the other thing you have with the Royal Navy that kind of is why they don't go into the Task Force Doctrine in the same scenario as the Americans do. Because the British already have divisions and squadrons all around the globe. So task forces are ultimately far more ad hoc and usually put together. The moment this force joined up, the moment Force K arrived, the South Atlantic Division would have been folded into Force K. And Doyle, Doyle, Leon, would have gained Commodore Harwood as his second-in-command. Thank you very much. And would have had 3 cruisers to back up, as part of his force to back up the network of Renown, Ark Royal, and the destroyers. And the odds are, you'd have had Renown and those 3 destroyers sitting opposite off the coast of River Plate and moving closer in, whilst Ark Royal launched her aircraft, the destroyers backed her up, and the Renown and the cruisers went, "Come on out, Grass Bay! You want to come play, don't you? Please come play!" How many Leanders did we build? I think we had 6. Let me check that, though, because I could be wrong. I know we didn't have as many Leander class. There were 8. There were 8. There is Leander, Orion, Neptune, Ajax, and Achilles, which are the 5 which are built for the Royal Navy. And then there's the Amphion class, which I tend to treat as a separate class because they're modified, which are given to the Royal Australian Navy, which are Amphion, Apollo, and Phaeton, which become Perth, Hobart, and Sydney. Why can't we rename the current Prince of Wales to Ark Royal? It's not really good luck to change a ship's name. Thank you, Royal Fananka. I knew we had... Well, we had 4 of the Arafusers. Which came after the Leanders. You want to forget that the Arafusers came after. We planned to build 6, we built 4 of them, and then of course we got the Town class after that, and we got 10 of those when we planned 12. The other thing the 2 ways you tend to track the Royal Navy about which theatres matter in World War II, they're where a Town class cruiser shows up and where a Tribal class destroyer arrives. If you find those 2 sitting there, that's a theatre which matters. Again, though, we were limited by treaty, cumulative tonnage. People often forget, they always think it's the individual tonnage which is the important thing of the treaties. No, it's the cumulative tonnage. Cumulative tonnage is far more problematic than the individual tonnage. Uh-huh. Yeah. Alright. I'm getting a whole load of emails coming in right now, and I have no idea why. All I know is they're flinging up as... I have a thing setting on my system where it goes, okay, if it's an important email, it gets marked as, and it shows up as a notification. And basically I have about 5 people who are marked as important. And this is going to sound like a humble brag, but it's my TV agent. I've talked about past preservers before, you know. If you do anything to do with history or anything where you're an expert and where you have expertise and knowledge, and you want to do TV work, or you want to do, you know, do some presenter, you want to have someone who represents you, basically make sure you get paid for it. They're a very good company to go through, because Nigel, who runs them, is actually a really great Egyptologist, and is someone you want to actually listen to if you get a chance. And he just sent me like 10 emails in the last 5 minutes, and I have no idea why. But they've all been flashing up, and I'm going, Nigel, I'm live. Nigel, I'm live. You retweeted the fact that I'm live. Why are you messaging me quite so much? Oh. Geoffrey, CSR had a habit of renaming the ship, so I think that superstition was mostly Western by 20th century. Yeah, look, we tend to not rename ships because it's considered unlucky, and that's been passed down in history. It's one of the reasons given for why we operated so many ships which can't retain their French names. Yeah. That's the excuse we're going with, and we're keeping to it. But yeah, in the run-up to World War II, you find a lot of task forces being formed and organised, and a lot of things being put in place because it works. Because they need to cover so much areas. And again, the British, the classic task force you will find is carrier, capital ship, cruiser, and the 4 or 5 destroyers. You'll also find a few which are cruisers and destroyers, depending on the area they are working in. So look, so what happened to the ASR? Do you see them around anymore? Hey! There you go, you have a place. They tempted luck too many times. Oh. Obviously someone has watched I will check the message. No, yeah. Goodness gracious me. No, it's basically, I flicked into the email because I'd answered it all, and it's stuff reminding me I need to apply, that I need to, actually, it is sort of like that, but it is a case of, Alex, have you contacted this person and this person? You're supposed to, okay, you need to contact them, they're interested in you, talking to you, and I'm sort of going, I received email, I'll do that, I will do that, I didn't get a chance to do it today, I do apologise. So, who knows, more TV work coming my way, maybe. Quite like doing TV work, I like, you know me, my view is I like to talk to people. And I like to try and get people interested in naval history, and so yeah, I like doing TV work. It's another way for me to share the addiction to naval history. Let's shrink that up a bit and get more questions out. Okay. CAM and Sea Scepter are the short-range system. Sea Streak, I have no idea. As far as I know, in UK terms, Sea Streak is a ferry company. There's Fire Streak. There's Starstreak. Starstreak is the manpad system, but that's not certified for sea use. That doesn't work on sea systems because it isn't saltwater protected. Oh, Yeah. I have now found it. There was a C version of the naval version of the naval manual that has been tested and developed. A close-in weapon system holding 24 missiles. But the cost of turning the missile into a saltwater viable weapon system was considered prohibitive. Yeah. Sorry, Mo. You are right. It does exist. But at the moment, at the moment, I'm reading the notes that I've got from, because I looked up my MOD missile folder, which is basically where I copy and paste all the I copy, download, put in all the various announcements they do over missiles. And the last announcement I have for C Streak was that it was considered cost prohibitive for conversion to that one. But it's good, you never know. It might come back. Someone might actually. I think the trouble is, it's kind of the option is to fit more cam. And at the moment they fitted a whole load of cam to it, and so they've got phalanx, they've got cam, they're trying to put money on the laser system, they're trying to do everything they can to avoid buying a 3-inch gun, because, that would just look embarrassing, to admit that they need to actually buy those, like the Italians and the French fitted to their equivalents to their versions of Horizon system. So, yeah, we'll see what happens. But what's really interesting to me about the Starstreak system and all these things is we're talking about nearly a 30-year-old weapon in service. It was designed in the 1980s, so it's it's getting up towards 50 years. I think that's the problem. Yeah, and it was back in the 90s, and I don't think they got back in the 90s. Well, the missile only ended service in 1997, so I think it was actually the early 2000s. But it was designed in the 1980s and was first produced in 1986. So yeah, but we are talking about a missile system which is definitely older than me. I know the B-52 has entered the chat, but the thing about the B-52 is it's had a lot of upgrades to keep it going, and today's B-52 is not your granddad's B-52. It's a very, very interesting aircraft. But it's basically a massive missile truck, and it's absolutely excellent at that. Missile systems tend to require slightly more effort. But yeah, I think it's to do with navalizing the fact that, your Starstreak is that missile which, of course, breaks up into 3 small missiles. And, yeah, it's a great idea, but it's also something which I think has proved complicated from the perspective of turning into a naval system and navalizing. However, both Portugal and India are currently looking at applying Starstreaks, so who knows? Things might change. Things might change. I'm glad to hear that. And night. Right on. Okay, so what is the greatest lesson going into modern war? Into the modern war was learned and then forgotten. Well, the lesson we keep forgetting time and time again is just how much depth of force structure you need. Numbers of force, but also weapons or depth of magazine on ships. In nicest way, I would say that if you look through the Cold War, ships slowly get lighter and lighter armed, especially Western ships. They're going, we've got the higher tech weapons. And if you look at the ships they're producing in the end of World War II or the end of World War I, and the ships which they're building even the ships they built after the Falklands War for a short while versus the ships they're building, the Type 45 is a classic example. There is no scenario where anyone sensible would have built those ships and gone, you know what, I'm not fitting the Mark 41 VLS tubes, I'm fitting it 4 not with, and I'm not fitting in the 3-inch guns as well as the phalanx, and I'm not fitting in... No. They should have gone, yeah, we'll take the Ottomilera 76, it's what is working, we're going to keep the 4.5-inch gun, sender, we're going to buy the phalanx as well. We're going to have three of each of the phalanx and the Ottomilera. Let's say we're going to have two Ottomilera sitting on port and starboard on the hangar with a phalanx on top. That's aft, and forward we're going to have an Ottomilera sitting above the VLS systems and the 4.5-inch in front of it, and we're going to have the... I don't know, the phalanx sitting on their sponsors afterwards, and we're going to have, you know, the Mark 41s were supposed to be strategic length cells. They were going to be the strategic length. Makes sense. Fine, go for it. You know, it doesn't matter. If your air defense missile cells are not strategic length, that really doesn't matter. In the nicest way, you're not going to... An air defense destroyer is not going to be sacrificing cruise missiles for surface-to-air missiles, so... That really doesn't matter. But also... You're sitting there going, and if you want cam as well, you know, position that in. Why are we having Asta 15 when we have Seawolf and Cam coming along? Why are we going to sit that VLS in as well? Have that VLS somewhere else in the ship, so you have those missiles as well. Do not have those as you know. Do not go, oh, we're going to add it in later. Because, if you think about it, if you're taking 48 Asta 30s, and you have... Maximum, it's 24 Mark 41 VLS tubes, I think, they could fit. 16 was what they are usually usually fitted with. Idea was they would fit it with, but actually it's 24 is what I understood it from Naval Architects at the time. And realistically, there was also space in the hull. They could have actually added in another 2 sets of VLS for the Asta system. So they could have taken up to 64 Asta 30s, let's say 24 Mark 41 VLS. So there you go. You have your 88 cells. Woohoo! You could also then have some cells for cam as well, somewhere along. You could have 2 sets of 16 of those. Well, actually, no, they're 12 cells. They're 6 cell packs. So you could have had 2 sets of 18. So you could have 36 of them somewhere else in the hull. And you could have built a destroyer, which is a very flexible asset. But no, they saved money. They had less weapons, and then they've got something to going, oh, we now need to modify and add these stuff to, and when we didn't fit enough engines when we could have done, and we didn't do enough and this, and then you sit there and go, yeah. Knight 681, the problem you've put in, the problem is always is, well, why are we buying the 3-inch gun when we, 4.5-inch gun and sand battery can do the job, both jobs just fine? Can they, though? The 4.5-inch gun is fitted at one point and primarily exists for providing fire support and general purpose utility. The SAM only has so many missiles. You're adding in the 3-inch guns, you can put them in different places in the superstructure. As I said, you can put them aft on the hangar, you can put them forward, you can raise them up, you can give them better fields of fire. And they add another layer of defense. They also add another set of magazine depth. And that's the point. Sitting there going, if that's really the policy, you could sit there and argue with some of the destroyers, some of the, you know, the cruisers in run up to World War II, which had 6-inch, 4-inch, and 40mm on them. Surely you can delete the 4-inch in that one and just have the 6-inch and the 40mm. No, you need both. You need them all. You need the layers. And it always helps to have more layers. It helps to be able to have the layers of the things. If you know, the 4.5-inch gun is great. Using that in air defense role, that's fine. That's a single gun though. So basically, the scenario is You get into short-range missile. You get into point defense missile range. You've got Cam engaging or Seawolf. You've had Astra in the outer range. You've had Cam in the shorter range. You get close to that. You've got a 4.5-inch gun engaging. Then the 3-inch guns come in. Then the phalanx engage. So you've got this escalation in firepower and volume of firepower which can focus on you. That's sensible. That's you filling the sky going, right then, what is the most blunt, basic methodology of air defense? Fill the sky with lead. Is it pretty? No. Is it effective? If something is going to get and it gets any closer and is going to kill me, that will guarantee to kill it. You can dodge round missiles. You can do all sorts of things that might get you through, might get you past them. It's very difficult to get through a wall of lead. And as I said, if the 3 inches and the 45-inch overlap too much, the 57mm is right there. True, Matthew Kenning. There's also the option of you could go for a 6-inch to replace the 4.5-inch. So there's also the soft power angle and emotional impact of seeing a ship armed with all that pull into your harbour. Yes, because those sort of levels of guns tend to have an impact. We've been talking about some Italian ships recently, some very beautiful Italian destroyers. Oh, there are some really good-looking Italian destroyers. That was a fun video to do, the Italian ones, and but I'm talking about the Cold War destroyers now when I'm talking about this, where basically the Italian approach was, we can fit a lot of weapons onto this ship. We're going to fit them. There was a lot of, the nicest way, you have to remember there is a lot of very good arguments which are ultimately, when you go through them, cost driven, which decide a lot of the decisions making in the process that happens. There is a lot of very interesting arguments put forward. Usually it comes down to efficiency and focus and value for money and all the other aspects, and you sit there and go, yeah, but in the modern warfare, if you consider that what's happened to the Type 45s in the drone era, if we were talking about a Type 45, which is a maximal Type 45, which had all those extra VLS and had those guns, would anyone be currently worried about the drone threat? Going, well, it has a 4.5, as well as the missile systems and the cam systems, which it has. You know, it has 36 cam missiles. It carries 64 Aster 30s. It has whatever's loaded in its Mark 41 VLS tubes, and it also has the 4.5-inch gun, the 3-inch guns, and the 3 phalanx systems. How many people would be worrying about drone systems coming after those destroyers? Because everyone would think, well, hang on. For a drone to get through that much firepower, it's going to have to be a lot of drones. And that's the reality. When you start looking at the current issues and people talk about the threats, they are literally mostly created by their own problems. A Type 45 with that level of firepower can deal with a lot of threats. A Type 45, as it's currently configured, has weaknesses because of what has been built into it by the people making decisions of funding. This is the trouble you sometimes get in discussions about kit. The ship that's built is what you have to deal with when you talk about these things. But you do sometimes sit there and go, wow, someone going, oh, modern warships can't deal with drones. They can if they've been armed properly. The trouble is we've been arming them, against the threat we presume is coming. What was the threat we presume was coming? Wars of choice and hypersonic missiles occasionally. And don't forget the 4-foot twin 30mm guns. I wouldn't say no to those either, Matthew Killing. And that scenario is, okay, that ship can rock you. Versus the ship we have. Yeah, land frustrated. Yes, you can put the question into this. Just put it in here, and I'll answer it in this. And that's what I tend to do. Questions at the end of the video tend to be a case of some subject related, some not subject related. But also there's brew ships on Sunday, which is always basically a generic thing of many discussions. It's just the standard brew ships this Sunday as well. So, what if supercarriers, as a carrier roughly the same as treaty battleships, was a class of ship defined on naval treaties, their own tonnage allowances? Then you get some very beautiful designs, but you basically get Midway/Maltas come early. If I have 35,000 tons to build a carrier, and I can build it fully armoured and with a full flight deck. And if you have those as well as the other carriers, so you have allowed 5, let's call the super carriers fleet carriers, and 5 other carriers. And you have 135,000 tons for your other carriers, you have 175,000 tons for your fleet carriers. The odds are, and I say this from a loving place, considering you can build that super carrier for pretty much 27,000 tons in standard. Anyway, you probably end up with people like the Royal Navy going, so 180,000 is 6 times 30. I'm allowed 175. I'm going to build 6 29,000-ton carriers in sand displacement. They're all 29,000 tons with water for armor. And then you probably find that your 135,000 ton of other carriers gets turned into something like a 15,000 ton carrier that they can churn out about 9 of. So they have the numbers of carriers, but that's going to change things in terms. It's going to allow everyone to basically have both the fleet carriers they need in terms of size and capability, and the numbers of carriers they need in terms of carriers for actually sea control and for the cruiser support missions. Stannis, the recent Trump move against electric catapults, do you think it will have any effect, and does he have a point? Look, electric catapults are a new thing coming into service, but the trouble is, to try and change back would require you to change so much of, especially the 4-class design coming through, it's virtually impossible. What do I mean that? Because you've got to change from having power conduits to having live steam moving around your ship. And that becomes a problem. So, it works. Does it have issues? Are we still ironing it out? Yes. The problem is you're comparing a system which is still new and in its infancy versus something which is a mature system. Let's be honest, we've been having variations of steam catapults around for about 80 to 100 years, depending on how you do the maths and how you work it out as capability. Before that, you had hydraulic catapults. I think he has arguments that can be made against it, because again, I said, it's a new system, but I don't think ultimately it's going to be changed too much. I think they do need to do some more investment in testing. They do need to do some more development with it. But there again, as said, it's a new system. But you would have to change so much in the architecture of the 4-class, it would be incredibly expensive. I'd also say Trump, when it comes to defense technology, and I mean this in the nicest way before anyone gets into this on a political point of view, is a reflection of a lot of other politicians when it comes to defense technology. They tend to have a very surface level understanding and are repeating bits of the last report they actually read on it. And that's partially because defense has become one of those areas where not a lot is discussed. And again, another reason I do this channel the way I do it is so I discuss these things and people, and we'll have a discussion place, and I will learn stuff as much as I hopefully you will learn stuff because of the stuff you'll be talking about. And occasionally there'll be stuff I've forgotten, like Sea Streak, which happened back in the early 2000s and 1990s, and literally was around for such a little time, I'd forgotten about it. But cool, thanks for remembering it. It's reminded me, and I can bring it up again as another thing which they forgot, which was silly. Or at least, if you're not going to do that, you should have had Cam on more things and more stuff for going at. But, so, that's the reality of what you're dealing with. They have limited time. He's got to, this is what I found funny. One thing I used to really like about The West Wing was it showed that so many decisions get made in 15-minute meetings. And you sit there and go, good God. And the reason they need to be going through 15-minute meetings is because they're going through such a large volume of things. It used to be we're talking about in the period before the run-up to World War I, the British cabinet would take entire days off to go and discuss Ireland. And they would literally not be discussing anything else all day. They'd just be discussing Ireland. Or they'd go off for a day and they'd be discussing industrial policy. You could never have a cabinet do that these days. There's too much needs to be going on simultaneously. It's all got to be done quickly, and there's a 24-hour news cycle which demands to be fed. The biggest problem I have with the modern world is usually a 24-hour news cycle. Because it's the constant need of feeding and answering questions and putting things forward, which are both good in it holds people to account, but bad in that sometimes they do stuff and say stuff just for the sake of saying stuff and doing stuff. Not for the sake of actually needing to do it or thinking it through. But yeah. I think it's hard to argue he doesn't have a point because there are still teething issues. But it's also hard to say, look, it doesn't need to be changed, mate. It needs to be worked on. It's the new system coming in and it does work. It's just, it is the brand new system and you're comparing its efficiency to a system which has been around for most of a century. So but if you compare early firearms to crossbows from the same time, well, you get the same amounts of current. You do realise there were actual people who were still protesting in the Napoleonic Wars that because of the average musketry engagement range and the rate of fire, the British Army should, instead of training people to use muskets, should be still equipping them with longbows. There were literally people making the argument that you should be turning the British Army into a longbow army because that was a more effective, efficient weapon than a musket. And the answer is it's true. But let's be honest, which should we prefer to be working on? Electricity or steam? The answer is electricity. Because trust me, whatever you think of electricity, high voltage electricity, as dangerous as the Mystic Arcs is, as dangerous as it is to everyone who touches it, it is a lot easier to control, a lot easier to look after than live steam. The difference is, though, in the Napoleonic War, those people who were making those arguments did not have access to things like Twitter to be able to share them with everyone and go, look at how good and how efficient this argument is. Instead, they could be looked at by people who just went, do you have any idea how long it takes to train a longbowman versus a musketman? Do you have any idea? Well, yes, we should start now, and then in 20 years' time we can field them. Where is my 2x4? There you go. Right on. So, just stay... you go learn how to use your longbow, and I'm going to chase you with this, and we'll see who's dead first, shall we? There you go. Piece of 2x4. Yeah, there are always people. No. No. Have you feeling electricity doesn't corrode all the things that keep it from expanding rapidly? Yeah. That and many other things electricity does is not as quite as evil as steam is. 9681. With the Raw Navy and USN Task Force Doctrine, how do you see Task Force Doctrine evolving as we get further into the age of UV and USV? As I've talked about before, I see each ship turning into its own little task group. So I think the task unit phraseology is going to become even more important because, yes, a ship is an individual task unit, but each ship is going to be at the each crewed ship is going to be at the center of a flotilla of uncrewed assets. So it's going to be task unit and then task force. So it's going to be it's going to be their de facto task. Every force is going to be a task group made up of these task units, and every task, it's going to add layers of command and control, which is going to be interesting. That's also going to add people to the crew. Everyone keeps talking about uncrewed assets are going to reduce personnel numbers. No, I think they're actually going to increase size of crewed ships, and they're going to increase personnel aboard crewed ships because you're going to need the people to actually run the uncrewed assets and maintain them. Wilson triplets. How did Midway go if Shokaku and Tsukaku were there? Ooh. If they are there, and they have got full air groups, because that's the assumption we make them if they're there, then that means the Japanese would have 5 fleet carriers. No, 6 fleet carriers. To the Americans' 3. Sorry, I've forgotten one of the fleet carriers. That is not going to be good for the Americans. Because you've got Akagi, Hiryu, Kaga, and Soryu already. If you add in Shokaku and Zukaku, you have some very hefty cable air groups. So if you have 6 to 3, whilst it's not necessarily, the fact could the Japanese still potentially lose all 4? Lose 4 of their carriers? Potentially. But there is also the reality you've got 2 more air groups carrying out reconnaissance, potentially, 2 more air groups carrying out strike, 2 more air groups for supporting air defense. That adds up. And that might well mean that you lose either Enterprise or Hornet as well. You might lose both. The Americans could be in a scenario where they sink 4 Japanese carriers still, but the Americans lose all 3 of theirs. In which case, it's a very different battle in its portrayal, because whilst the Japanese have lost more, the Americans having 3 carriers gone, they'd be in a really bad situation. So, you've added in 2 extra air groups. That's a lot of variables you've added in. A lot of capability you've added in. Yes, Stannis, this is for the Catapults discussion. So it's a system that does have a future potential. The issues are a step, but the core is a good direction. Yeah, they are working towards it, and also they're decreasing reliability as said to do. We're talking about the first few ships to be fitted with it. I think Currently, only USS Gerald Ford is currently the only ship which is fitted with the catapults, as far as I can see. Email system. Yeah. It's only fitted on USS Gerald Ford. France is potentially looking at it. But, yeah, currently it's only aboard Ford. Literally, it's only aboard Ford. So, this is the first ship to be fitted with the first operational system. That's kind of cruel going, wow, its reliability is not as good as the system which will be fitted to hundreds of vessels over nearly a century. It's terrible. Are we surprised? I guess as a person who has experience of trying to put a lot of electricity into small space, actually does corrode just differently. Yes, but it's not quite the same as steam, and also you can tend to have ways that automatically stop it causing trouble for everyone, whereas steam has a way of automatically wiping out the skin density of humans nearby. So yeah, it's fitted to one ship. No, son, as the tech is ready. It's been fitted to only one ship, and we're still testing it and working it out. It's kind of like, until you get the thing aboard a ship and actually try to use it day to day, you have no idea what problems are going to happen in these things. Again, a system can work perfectly on land and do everything it's supposed to do. Until it's fitted aboard the ship, you don't know. Soon to be 2 when JFK. Nicest way. JFK. How much has she been delayed again? She's expected in service in 2027. Now remember, Ford was laid down in 2009. She launched in 2013 and commissioned in 2017. So she was 8 years, just under 8 years, going from laying down to commissioning. John F. Kennedy was laid down in 2015, launched in 2019, is expected in 2027. 12 years. Enterprise is expected to take 9 years. I think the trouble is, to my mind, is that realistically, the US Navy were looking to test and develop a whole lot of technologies, and you almost needed to build the Ford earlier. You almost needed to build the Gerald R. Ford as a one-off before the last of the Nimitz entered service. So basically it went Ford and then went Nimitz, and then build a class based on the Ford technologies. But you cannot get useful data until you actually bring the service and ship into service. And on the subject of retrofitting a hull for the emails, the thing is, again, you could have retrofitted one of Kennedy's or maybe a USS Enterprise herself and tried to do some testing, but That would have taken a lot of work, because again, you'd have to remove the steam infrastructure and lay in the power infrastructure to do it. So you'd have to do a lot of work on the ship to actually get it to work. So yeah, we have a new system. It's coming in. It is the future of the system. It is the future system. Has it got problems? Yes. Has it only been fitted so far to one carrier? Yes. There's another one coming in. Will that hopefully have better? Because one of the reasons why Kennedy's been delayed is it's had a lot of improvements from the Ford built into it as it's been building. Yes, hopefully. Will Enterprise HACVN-80 be better than Kennedy? Hopefully. By the time we get to the George W. Bush or CVN-83, probably we will not be having these same questions. But if you consider at the pace of construction, it was 6 years before they started building the Kennedy, 7 years before they started building the Enterprise. It's supposed, in the nicest way, if the Doris Miller was going to enter service at the time in 2034 when it's supposed to, I would expect it to be laid down by now, because it's supposed to enter service 3 years after the Enterprise. So realistically, I would have expected it to be laid down in 2025. It was expected to be laid down in 2026, but it still hasn't been. And so, let's say it's laid down some point this year. So there's 5 years. So it goes 7 years, 5 years. Let's say they get the next one in down to the 3 years. They do actually do it in the 3 years of George W. Bush. Well, you're probably not going to see the Bush laid down till, what, 2033? And not in service till the 2040s. So, this is the reality. This is the thing of people saying, are you rushing the implementation? No, it's on one ship. It's going to be on 2 ships soon. Then we'll be on 3 ships. And slowly we're going to fix it, or fix all the problems and work them out. But it takes time. Please, go back and look at the arguments about steam versus hydraulic catapults back from the 1930s and in the 1940s. You'll hear all the same things. If not more. Some of them even weirder. Apparently steam catapults, the steam venting corroded the aircraft. Hydraulic catapults didn't do that. Don't get me started on it, please don't. The amount of weird stuff which comes out of sometimes in these things is just absurd. Lions, if you want one operational and one available all the time, is the minimum number of ships? What is the minimum number of ships you need? 4, preferably 5. Hydraulic catapults, that was the thing. Yeah. Hydraulic catapults were the standard catapults used in the 1930s and mostly through World War II. Hydraulic catapults are what comes before steam catapults. So, yeah. There's a great research paper from 1935. I will put that in. I will put that in the list for you all, because I quickly went and found it because I had a link to it for you all. It has a great... By the way, I'm going to post this link in the description below on the YouTube. But, yeah, please go look it up because it has got an absolutely killer last paragraph. Absolutely killer last paragraph. And it's written in 1935. But it basically says, the perfection, and that perfection is on the table. It is as true of catapults as any other device. The perfect catapult would be of negligible weight, occupy negligible space, and require no maintenance. This cannot be claimed for the new catapult, which, though lighter than corresponding hydropneumatic catapults, is still of considerable weight and occupies valuable space high up in the ship. Nevertheless, it is a considerable advance, and as with any novel device, it is at the beginning of its development, so that further improvements and refinements in design may be expected. It is not for the writer of this article to discuss the tactical effect of the greater performance offered by the BS-4 catapult, both as regards freedom of carrier operations and in facilitating the use of higher performance aircraft, or permitting reduction in size and weight of aircraft from the same performance and endurance, but the benefits would appear to be considerable. Yep, Matthew Gilling. There are also tests for spring-powered catapults, operational gunpowder catapults, and rocket-side catapults as well. There were lots of ideas for different catapults. And the hydraulic catapults were around for quite a while, and they were... Were they good? They did their job. Are they the best? There are many... There's a reason we go for steam catapults. Right. So, we'll do this and this. Joel Fredericks, with increasing American political polarization, do you think the future USN would stop naming ships after politicians? I wonder if they're going to lessen the prominence of the ships named after politicians. At the moment, they have this habit of naming aircraft carriers after presidents, which they might change. However, there's a problem with doing that, because who's going to be the last one who gets named after him? At the moment, you have Bill Clinton and George W. Bush listed as it. Are you going to get, who... the thing is, if you go, I don't want to... there's going to be no Barack Obama. Well, that's going to piss off one side... that's going to, excuse the French, piss off one side of the debate and one side of the aisle. Because why should there's been a George W. Bush, why is there no Barack Obama? Then there's going to be, well, after Obama comes Trump. But you might go, well, Trump was too divisive. Well, Obama was divisive to other people. This is the problem. So either you keep doing it, or you stop completely. And which means you need to probably, in the nicest way, rename Clinton and Bush before they even get launched. So basically you stop with John F. Kennedy, Enterprise, Doris Miller. You've then moved to a completely, you've moved to a different standard quite quickly. Now, the big problem with hydraulic catapults is the same problems airliners have. If the hydraulic line is breached, you have a loss of pressure and loss of hydraulics. Yeah! But they still were the option. That's the thing. there is often, in terms of defense technology, in terms of equipment we use, it's not a case of this is a good option versus a bad option. This is the least worst option that fits our current technological level. That is it. The hydropneumatic catapults were the least worst option available at their technological level available at the time. And that's the reality. That's what you have to go with. So a lot of the technology in defense is not necessarily the technology you would want them to have, it's the technology you have. So I bet some of those ideas had their uses, but not as aircraft launch mechanisms for aircraft carriers. You'd be surprised at how many of them actually got used at various points. Yeah, immediately you've gone for Obama and Biden, but if Trump doesn't get it, nice way are the Republicans going to vote for it. You cannot have a USS Obama and a USS Biden if you don't have a USS Trump. Because just because one side of the aisle don't like Trump and don't think he deserves a carrier, there are people on the other side of the aisle who would argue the same about the other two, potentially, especially Biden. Maybe more so than Obama. I don't agree with either side. I go, you either name it after all presidents or you don't. You either do one or the other. Once you're in that loop, you either do one or the other. You don't start picking, because if you start picking, you're going to alienate half your country. And that's a problem. Navies can't afford to do that. So you either, as said, CVN 82 and 83 need to have their names changed before they're laid down. Currently they're only in the planning stage. Doris Miller is interesting, but unlikely to have a name changed. Or you accept that you're going to have what comes after that. That 84 is going to be Obama, that 85 is going to be Trump, that 86 is going to be Biden, and 87 is going to be whoever comes after Trump. Brock, I recently found we were experimenting electric catapults shortly after World War II. Yes. That's the thing, is electromagnetic catapults date back to the 1940s. They were actually being tested at the same time as the first steam catapults were, but steam catapults were the viable technology at the time they could go with. No, Knight, because I'm sure you have a perfectly logical argument for why you think Trump shouldn't get one, but the trouble is, that's one side of the political aisle. And as I often say, this is not a political channel, this is a history channel. And frankly, yeah, in the nicest way, the joy of being me and working in the field I do and working for, I hear from both sides of the political aisle from the American debate. And the beauty of being me is I'm British, so ultimately, it really, I don't vote either way for their presidents, so whilst I might have my preferences, I'm not got a skin in the game like they do. And if you say to some people, if you go to some of the deep red states in America and you said, well, yeah, Trump can't have a carrier, but we're going to make the name one after Obama and Biden, that's a good way to start trouble. And it's also a silly political debate to get into if you're the US Navy. And this is the problem with the carriers being named after them. But ultimately, the carrier decisions and naming decisions ultimately head back to Congress. So we'll see what they come of. Lions, you should not name a vessel after a living person, would be a suggestion. That was what Queen Elizabeth preferred. Which is why HMS Queen Elizabeth is actually named after Queen Elizabeth I, not the second. And the SSBN is being named after her father. Because her father also didn't want it the class named after a living king. So that could be the policy the Americans go, we don't want to name them after living presidents. But in which case, and this is going to sound terrible, but that means Clinton and Bush don't get theirs. So that's a whole different debate, though. Myself, I would probably suggest that Lexington, Saratoga, Yorktown, there are lots of options they could go to for names of carriers to see them through a bit and let them decide on what they want to do in their future. But they haven't gone there yet. Robert Sidron, either Obama nor Trump served in the military, so I don't think either ship should be named after them. Yeah, the trouble is there's Clinton and Bush, which are also to be getting one, and it's currently listed as names, and then we can go back through other presidents which have been named, which have had carriers named for them, and yeah, it's a case of I can see where you're coming from, but that becomes a problematic thing to establish when military service is not a criteria required for voting, and therefore becoming president. And if you start saying, well, no, if you haven't served in the military and you've changed the right of president, you don't get a carrier, whereas someone who served in the military does get a carrier, that becomes a status symbol and turns military service into something they have to tick off. And that's, I'm not too keen on the idea of. People who are politically minded serving military service into something they tick off so they can get their carrier when they become president. Yeah. I think it used to be the sub policy in the US that nothing outside their presidential library is named after living ex-presidents. that was a good policy to have if it was the case. It's a whole debate to get into. It really is. But it's a case of also, look, as I keep saying, that's not a discussion which the US Navy wants to get into, because either they do or they don't. Either they don't have Clinton and Bush, and they go completely they change all the names to non-political to avoid what potentially is coming up in a few years, or they just keep going with it and go, look, in nicest way, it's named for the president, it's named for the office they hold, rather than the person. For the fact this person has been president of the United States, that is who we name it for. That's their choice. But either way, they're in trouble. But that's the thing. You can't get to a scenario, and you don't want to get to a scenario, whereby the US Navy is seen to be being partisan. And I'm sorry, again, you might not like the person as a political leader, but there are going to be people on the other side of the aisle who do and who don't like the person you like. There are very few people like me who really don't like any of the leaders they've had over the last few years, and are not can find fault in all of them. Most people tend to have, oh, I remember them, they were a good prime minister, versus, oh, damn, they were a bad prime minister. And there's me going, No, that one cut that, and that from defence and did that in education and that in health, so particularly keen on that one. That one did that to infrastructure, that to, yeah, that's rare. So you have to remember this. Just because your side of the debate and your friends don't like someone, doesn't mean there's another side somewhere who do like that person. And don't like the person you like. And this is the trouble when you're naming ships after presidents, because it's going to be divisive whatever you do. If you name them after them, that's divisive because you're going to upset some people. But if you don't name after them, that's going to upset other people. And there's also going to be the people who are, like me, who are going to get annoyed with you causing that as a debate. Because the thing is, as I said, if you carry on naming ships after presidents, let's say doesn't, and then someone goes, "I will not naming it after," let's say Trump, then the debate for the next 10 years is going to be about that, not about whether the carriers you buy and the state of the case. It's going to be the politics of the naming. It is going to be that. Why did they start doing politics? Because it was a big thing to say, look, we've had a president as the Democrats, and his name is on a ship, on an aircraft carrier, and the same with the Republicans. And it's a way of getting congressional funding. And that's 1964, you'll run out of names sooner or later. Not at the rate they're building carriers. And a nice way, at the rate they're building carriers and the rate they have new presidents, the nicest way, they're not going to run out of names anytime soon. If they were building the carriers faster, then they'd have run into trouble. Alright, with that being said, I think we have run out of questions. Barring Joel Frederick's next one. So I'm going to end the Q&A. And I'm going to answer the last question. Speaking of ship names, do you think the plan might eventually name a carrier after Taiwan? I doubt they'll name a carrier after Taiwan. They currently are doing the provinces thing with their destroyers, though, so we'll see what happens. I don't think a carrier is going to get named after Taiwan. Again, for political reasons. Maybe after they've taken Taiwan, if they've managed to get Taiwan to reunify somehow, either by taking it or by whatever political coercion or whatever they do on that front. But unless they actually own Taiwan, they're not going to name a carrier after it. Because there's just too much alliteration of Taiwan sinking Taiwan. And if it's a carrier, it's got the status, whereas if it's a destroyer, it's just one of the mass, and no one really knows if it's been sunk or not in a major war. Anyway, thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed. Go back, stop naming ships after living people and go back to the original George Washington and continue presence for that. Ah, yes, but there is problems with naming after George Washington because, of course, he was a slave owner. And whilst I agree, I personally wouldn't, and I'm not particularly keen on their whole slave owning as a concept. At the time, so were quite a lot of people. But you want to name a carrier after him now? Expect there to be problems. Expect there to be the political debate over it. There is going to be a Friday video tomorrow. It's going to be the German destroyers video. Enjoy. Thank you very much, everyone. I will be on Discord in a bit, but as said, I won't be on there for long because I'm kind of peopled out today. And I mean that in the nicest way. I've enjoyed this time greatly with all of you. I always do. Thank you for joining me for the live. Thank you for joining me for the discussion. If I'm not mistaken, next week's live should be up, and the patron vote should be going to live tomorrow. I have got someone to send I think I've got someone to send a Twitch people to, so I will do that. I think, yeah, next Thursday's is not up yet, but I think if I'm not mistaken, next Thursday's is... Oh yeah, next Thursday's I'm not going to announce yet because I've got something else planned for that one. Okay, it's coming. It's coming. I'll be putting it out soon. Sorry, I just realised I almost ruined my own surprise. Yay. Anyway, right, with that being said, I'm going to quickly do a raid for the lovely people on Twitch. Say thank you everyone for being here. Hope you enjoyed. I'm going to raid into someone who's going to be quite fun, and I think you'll enjoy her. Currently she's away from her desk, but she'll be back shortly. She will be back shortly. And, well, thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. If you liked the video, please do like, share, and subscribe. It really does help the channel grow, and thank you for being here. Toodles, and see you for another live on Sunday, and another live next Thursday. Hopefully it's cooler, hopefully it's not hot. Anyway, with that being said, enjoy. And keep naval history. Toodles. Honestly, on the YouTube scenario, I still really don't know how to raid on YouTube. I know there's a theoretical way, and I'm trying to work it out, but I still haven't got there. I can do it on Twitch. I can't do it on YouTube. Take care, everyone. Toodles.